She healed people for 30 years. Then she learned how to do something worse. XoXaan was not born evil. She was born gifted one of the most skilled healers the Jedi Order had ever trained. She could feel injury through the Force, the way most people feel heat. She knew where tissue had torn before she touched it. She knew which wounds would kill and which ones only looked like they would. She saved hundreds of lives. Then she started asking questions the Jedi did not want answered. What if healing required pain to work properly? What if the Force did not separate damage from repair? What if they were the same current, running in two directions at once? What if the Order's rules were not wisdom? What if they were just fear, dressed up as discipline? The Jedi had an answer for questions like that. Exile. She was not the only one they sent away. There were 8 of them in total, 8 Jedi who had pushed too far in the wrong direction, who had used the dark side in ways the Order could not forgive or ignore. Together, they had fought the Jedi in a conflict that lasted a century. The histories would call it the 100-Year Darkness. The 8 exiles would not have called it that. They would have called it a disagreement that went too long and ended badly. They lost. The Republic loaded them onto a vessel and pointed it toward the edge of known space, past the Stygian caldera, past the last charted system, past the boundary of anything the Republic considered worth defending. The expectation was that they would drift until the ship failed, and then they would die, and the problem would be finished. They found Korriban instead. Korriban was red. Red stone. Red dust. A sky that turned deep amber at midday, and the color of old blood at dusk. The wind came from the south in long, dry waves that carried the fine grit of the valley floors into every sealed room and every sleeping face. It was not a comfortable world, but it was alive with the Force, alive in a way none of the 8 exiles had felt before, not even in the deepest meditation chambers of the Jedi Temple. The dark side ran through Korriban the way groundwater runs through stone, constant, deep, patient. The 8 exiles landed. They were not alone. The native species, tall, broad, with skin the color of the stone they lived among, came out to meet them. The Sith, not the tradition, not the Order. The species, red-skinned, ridge-faced, Force-sensitive in ways that were raw and unschooled and enormous. They had built a civilization across these valleys over thousands of years. They had their own kings, their own rituals, their own understanding of the dark force that saturated their world. They looked at the 8 exiles and decided they were gods. It was not the worst misunderstanding that had ever benefited a group of tired, stranded outcasts. Ajunta Paul, the most powerful of the 8, the one who had led the rebellion against the Jedi, became the first Dark Lord of the Sith. That title would echo down through 10,000 years of history. In the moment he received it, it simply meant that the red-skinned people of this red world had chosen him as the one who stood above the others. XoXaan was not chosen for power. She was chosen for something the Sith species recognized more immediately. She could fix what was broken. The Sith people had healers of their own, shamans and bone setters and practitioners of a rough Force medicine that worked more often than it had any right to, but their methods were limited. Their knowledge had gaps. They lost people to injuries that XoXaan could read in an instant, could read and repair, if she was given the time and the space to work. She started working. Within the first season on Korriban, she had treated over 100 Sith wounds from hunting, from territorial conflicts, from the simply dangerous business of living on a world that was not gentle. She worked in a stone room, that one of the local chieftains cleared for her. She worked with what she had brought and with what the Sith supplied when she asked for it. She learned the Sith body the way she had learned every body before it, slowly, precisely, with the patience of someone who understood that rushing was the fastest way to kill the person in front of you. The Sith watched her work. They had never seen healing like this. Not the rough shamanic methods they knew. Not the brutal field medicine of their own warriors. Something quieter, something that reached into a body and corrected it at a level deeper than bone or tissue. They called her blessed. They were not entirely wrong, but XoXaan was not interested in being blessed. She was interested in the question that had been building since before the exile, since the last years in the Jedi Order, when she had first begun to suspect that what she was doing was only a fraction of what was possible. The dark side of the Force ran through Korriban like a current through deep water. She had always used the light side to heal. What would happen if she used the other one? It took her 2 years to find out. The first attempt was on a dying warrior, a Sith tribesman who had taken a wound to the chest during a hunt that should not have been survivable. By the time he was brought to her, he had perhaps an hour, maybe less. XoXaan looked at the wound and ran the standard assessment and understood immediately that the light side approach, the Jedi approach, the approach she had used 10,000 times, was not going to be enough. The damage was too deep. Too much had already been lost. She made a choice. She reached into the dark current that ran beneath everything on this world, and she used it. The warrior lived. He was not the same afterward. There was something different in his eyes when he woke, a heaviness, a quality of having been somewhere and returned with the memory still attached. He did not speak about it. He recovered fully, physically, but those who knew him well said the change was permanent. Something in him had been repaired with materials that were not the same as what had been removed. XoXaan wrote down what she had done, carefully, precisely. She was a scientist of the body before she was anything else, and what she had just performed was something that had never been documented. She did it again on the next patient, who was beyond ordinary reach, and the one after that. She was not careless with it. She was not reckless. Each time, she wrote down what she observed, the mechanics of the process, the cost to the patient, the changes that followed, the duration of those changes. She was building something, a methodology, a new discipline that sat at the intersection of healing and damage, that understood both as aspects of the same force rather than opposing forces in conflict. The other exiles watched her work with mixed reactions. Ajunta Pall was cautious. He had not survived 100 years of war against the Jedi by being impulsive, and he recognized that XoXaan was doing something with unknown long-term implications. He did not stop her, but he watched. The others were less cautious. Carnes Muir, who would later develop Sith alchemy in directions that made XoXaan's work look conservative, thought she was being too slow, too careful, too attached to the healer's ethic of minimum harm. XoXaan told him to be patient. She had a process. By the 3rd year, the process had become a practice. She had trained 6 Sith healers in her methods, not fully, not the deeper levels, but enough to handle ordinary cases without her direct involvement. She had documented 17 distinct applications of dark side healing across different injury types. She had begun to understand the cost of the technique more precisely, not just to the patient, but to the practitioner. Using the dark current to heal was not neutral. It left something behind. In the patient, a residue. In the practitioner, a kind of appetite, a small increase each time, In the pull toward the darker application, she wrote this down too. She did not stop. The practice needed a ritual form. That was what she determined in the 3rd year. The techniques she had developed were powerful, but they were also intimate. They required the practitioner to hold 2 things simultaneously: the injury and the repair, the damage and the will to correct it. That dual holding was difficult. It required a specific mental state that was hard to reach without preparation. She decided the practice needed a ceremony around it, and the ceremony needed an object to anchor it. She went to the best artisan among the Sith. She had treated a craftsman named in the records only by his title, the Carver of the 3rd Valley, and she described what she needed: obsidian, local stone. The surface was to be smooth, the interior slightly rough to the touch. The shape would cover the face from the brow to just below the chin. The exterior was to carry specific glyphs. She drew them out carefully on a piece of prepared skin in the early notation system she had developed for her medical records, which would evolve over the following centuries into what historians would eventually call Proto-Sith script. The glyphs described in compressed form the core principles of the technique. They were not decorative, they were instructional. Anyone who could read them would understand, in outline, what the mask was for and how the practice it represented was meant to function. The carver listened. He asked 3 questions about depth, about width at the jaw, about whether the eye openings should be perfectly circular or slightly elongated. XoXaan answered precisely. He nodded and went to work. She returned to him 12 days later. The exterior was finished. The glyphs were carved cleanly. The carver had understood the notation system better than she had expected, well enough to execute the forms accurately, even without understanding their meaning. The obsidian had been sourced from a deep valley deposit that gave it a particular quality of darkness, not flat black, but a depth that shifted slightly in different light, as though the stone was not entirely still. XoXaan examined the exterior for a long time. Then she asked the carver to leave her alone with it. She sat at his workbench with a small pointed tool she had brought from her own supplies, a medical instrument designed for precise incisions, and she began carving the interior. The glyphs on the interior were not the same as the ones on the exterior. The exterior glyphs were the methodology, the public record, the instructional text. The interior glyphs were something else. She worked for most of a day. The characters she cut into the obsidian were in a script she had invented herself over the previous 2 years, a notation system derived from the healer's shorthand she had developed in the Jedi Order, modified to accommodate concepts for which no existing script had words. The dark side healing she had developed required descriptions of states and processes that the standard languages simply could not carry. She had built her own system to carry them. What she wrote on the interior of the mask was the core theory, not the applications, the theory, the underlying understanding of what the dark current was, how it intersected with life and injury, why it worked the way it worked, and what it cost. It was the most complete record she ever produced of her own thinking. She finished as the light outside the carver's workshop began to fade toward the amber of a Korriban dusk. She examined the interior glyphs in the last of the day's light. They were small and dense, and would be invisible to anyone who did not know to look for them. She returned the tool to her supply case. She called the carver back in and told him the mask was finished. She paid him in the local currency, a measure of refined ore that the Sith valued above almost everything else. She carried the mask home herself. That night, She placed it on the stand she had prepared, carved obsidian, low enough that the mask sat at eye level when she stood before it. She looked at it for a long time. In the morning, there was a patient, another dying warrior, another wound past ordinary repair. She performed the ceremony for the first time. She lifted the mask and settled it against her face. It was heavier than she had expected. Not impossibly heavy, not so heavy that it changed how she moved, but there was a weight to it that was more than stone, a settled, a specific gravity that she had not anticipated and could not entirely account for. She held that weight and worked. The patient lived. Afterward, she removed the mask and set it back on its stand. For a moment, before she turned away, the polished obsidian surface caught the lamplight and returned her own reflection back to her. She looked at herself for a moment. Then she turned away and went to write down what had happened, and the mask sat still on its stand in the dark chamber and held what it had been given. It had been in the world for less than a day. It had already begun to accumulate. 200 years passed. The mask sat on its stand in the inner chamber of XoXaan's tomb and did not move. The stand was the same carved obsidian she had placed it on during her life. The chamber was the same stone room where she had worked and slept and written in the final decades before her death. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The low table, the sealed containers of her medical instruments, the stacked records of her research pressed between flat stones to keep them from curling. The Sith who sealed her tomb had not touched any of it. They were afraid to. XoXaan had been many things in life: healer, exile, teacher, architect of a tradition that would outlast everyone who had known her personally. In death, she became something simpler and more powerful, a god that needed to stay buried. The Sith Empire she had helped build was 2 centuries old now, and it did not much resemble what the 8 exiles had arrived to find. It was larger, much larger. What had begun as a settlement in the Valley of the Dark Lords had expanded across Korriban, then across neighboring systems, then further into the Outer Rim, into territories the Republic had never charted, into worlds that the Sith species had been reaching toward for generations before the exiles arrived, and gave them the tools to actually get there. It was also more violent than it had been. The early years had been violent too. Subjugation rarely looks peaceful from the inside, but the violence then had a quality of establishment to it. Things were being built, hierarchies were being settled. The 8 exiles and the native Sith species were still in the process of becoming something together. 2 centuries later, the building was finished. What remained was maintenance, and maintenance in a dark side empire looked like war. The original 8 exiles were all dead. Ajunta Paul had died first, then the others in various orders over the following century, each of them leaving behind tombs and legacies, and a tradition that their successors interpreted with decreasing accuracy. The Dark Lords who followed them were powerful. They were not the same. XoXaan's healing tradition had survived her death by perhaps 3 generations of practitioners. Then it had narrowed. Then it had simplified. Then it had become something more like battlefield triage than the precise, theoretical discipline she had spent her life developing. By the 214th year of the crossing, almost no one in the Sith Empire could read the glyphs she had carved on the interior of the mask. Almost no one was even looking. Merrick had been looking for 40 years. He was not a warrior. He was not a conqueror. He held the title of Sith Lord. It would have been dangerous not to, in the Empire as it currently operated, but his power was organizational rather than martial. He understood objects. He understood that the founders had made things, had touched things, had left impressions of themselves in the physical world that were recoverable if a person was patient and methodical and willing to spend money in the right places. He had spent a great deal of money. His collection occupied an entire wing of his citadel on a Sith-controlled world, 3 systems from Korriban. A sandstone tablet recovered from the rubble of a Junta Paul's first settlement. The inscriptions on it were in an early form of Sith that even Merrick could only partially read, but the resonance in the stone was unmistakable to anyone Force-sensitive. A staff fragment associated with Carnus Muir, the lower third only, the wood partially burned, the metal fittings still intact. 3 objects of uncertain attribution that Merrick had acquired from dealers who claimed provenance they could not fully document. He catalogued everything precisely. He believed, and the belief was not unreasonable, given what he could sense in the objects he already held, that the founders had left something of themselves in the things they made and used, not deliberately, not through any specific technique, simply through the accumulation of contact and intention over decades of use. He believed that studying these objects was the most direct available path to understanding what the founders had actually known, what they had actually been capable of. XoXaan's tomb was the problem he had been circling for years. Her burial site was the most intact of the original exiles' tombs. The others had been entered some multiple times, some thoroughly plundered in the centuries since the founders' deaths. XoXaan's had not. The Sith, who maintained the Valley of the Dark Lords, had kept it sealed with a consistency that bordered on superstitious. There were stories not documented, not reliable, but persistent about what happened to people who entered without the proper preparation. Merrick did not believe the stories. He believed in preparation. He arrived at Korriban in what the standard Sith reckoning called the early Ashen month of the 214th year of the crossing. He brought 3 students, not warriors, scholars, chosen for their sensitivity to force resonance and their ability to document what they observed without losing composure. He had trained them himself over the previous decade. He trusted their steadiness. The morning they entered XoXaan's tomb was dry and still. The outer door had been sealed with a combination of physical stone and force-worked material that took Merrick most of the morning to undo properly. He was not rushing. The students documented each step, the composition of the seal, the specific techniques used to embed the force working into the stone, the date and condition of the original construction. The seal gave way around midday. The air that came out of the tomb when the outer door opened was cold, colder than the stone around it had any right to be, given Korriban's ambient temperature. It carried a smell that Merrick had encountered once before, in a much smaller sealed chamber on a different world. The smell of a place where the dark side had been pooling undisturbed for a very long time. He stepped inside. The first student followed him. 20 feet into the outer passage, the first student stopped walking. Merrick turned. The student was standing completely still, both hands at his sides, eyes open but not focused on anything in the physical room. His face had gone the particular color of someone experiencing something the body did not know how to process. He did not respond when Merrick spoke his name. Merrick spoke it again. The student sat down on the floor of the passage and did not get up. He was not dead. He was breathing. But he was somewhere else, somewhere the passage had sent him when the accumulated resonance of 2 centuries hit a mind that was sensitive enough to receive it, but not trained enough to hold it without being pulled under. Merrick noted the time in his records. He continued. The second student made it to the inner passage before the same thing happened. She was stronger than the first. She had more experience with high resonance environments, and she had the particular kind of controlled attention that Merrick valued most in his students. She went further than the first. She documented 3 more observations before her stylus stopped moving, and she sat down against the wall with her knees drawn up and her head forward and stopped responding to anything Merrick said. Still breathing, still somewhere else. The third student looked at her and turned and walked back toward the entrance without speaking. Merrick did not call after him. He understood. Not everyone was built for this kind of work, and a student who knew his limits was more valuable in the long run than one who pushed past them and broke. Merrick went forward alone. The inner chamber was 30 feet further. The resonance in the passage was not painful, not exactly. It was more like pressure, a quality of attention directed at anyone moving through the space, as though the accumulated dark side energy that had been building in the sealed tomb for 200 years had developed a kind of orientation, a slow, unfocused awareness that was not intelligence but was also not nothing. It pressed. Merrick pressed back. He had spent 40 years studying the Founders. He had held a Junta Paul sandstone tablet in his bare hands for 6 hours on the day he acquired it, sitting with the resonance until it settled into something he could work with rather than something that worked on him. He knew how to hold his ground in the presence of accumulated dark side power. He reached the inner chamber door. It was not sealed the way the outer door had been. It was simply closed, a heavy stone panel set into the frame, the same technique used throughout the tomb. Merrick pushed it open. The chamber inside was exactly as it had been left. The low table, the sealed containers, the stacked records, the carved obsidian stand beside what had been her sleeping area. And on the stand, the mask. Merrick stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it without moving. Even from across the room, the resonance coming off it was different from the general resonance of the tomb. The tomb's atmosphere was the accumulated dark side energy of 2 centuries in a sealed space, broad, diffuse, the product of the location rather than any specific object. The mask was something more pointed. 200 years in this chamber had not diluted what it carried. If anything, the sealed environment had concentrated it. He crossed the room slowly and stood before the stand. Up close, the obsidian surface had the same quality he had noticed from the doorway. Not flat black, but a depth that shifted in the lamplight he carried, as though the stone was not entirely uniform all the way through. The exterior glyphs caught the light differently from the surrounding surface. He leaned close and studied them. He could not read them. He recognized the style early, pre-classical, the notation system the original exiles had used in their first years on Korriban, before the Sith scribal tradition standardized into something more widely teachable. He had encountered fragments of this script before, in other recovered documents. He knew enough to recognize that these glyphs were instructional rather than decorative. He did not know enough to read what they instructed. He turned the mask over carefully and examined the interior. The glyphs there stopped him entirely. They were smaller than the exterior ones, denser, cut with something finer than the tool that had shaped the exterior, a precision instrument. A medical tool, perhaps, the kind of thing a healer would carry. The script was the same early pre-classical system, but used differently, more compressed, more personal, written with the speed of someone recording something they understood completely, rather than the careful deliberateness of someone composing for an audience. Merrick could not read these either, but he could feel, with the particular sensitivity that 40 years of studying Founder artifacts had developed in him, that these glyphs had been cut by the same hands that had commissioned the mask, not a copyist, not a student recording a teacher's words. The person who made the mask had also written on its interior, and what they had written there was different in nature from what they had written on the outside. He held the mask for a long time without putting it on. That night, he made camp in the outer passage. He did not want to sleep in the inner chamber, and he did not want to carry the mask out of the tomb before he had spent more time with it. His two incapacitated students had recovered enough to sit up and eat, though neither of them spoke much. The third had not returned. Merrick ate his own meal, and then sat with the mask in his lap and thought about what to do with it. He had never worn a Founder artifact before. He had held them, he had studied them, he had spent long hours in close proximity to objects that carried enormous resonance, and he had learned to work with that resonance without being overwhelmed by it. But wearing something, putting it against his face, having it in direct contact with his skin, his eyes, his breath, was a different order of engagement. He decided to do it anyway. He sat in the posture he used for deep force work. He steadied his breathing. He waited until his mind was as calm and organized as he could make it. Then he lifted the mask and settled it against his face. It was heavier than he expected. That was his first thought, the weight of it, more than the stone alone accounted for. His second thought was not a thought at all. It was a pressure behind his eyes, not painful, not overwhelming, but unmistakable, a quality of being looked through rather than looked at. Something that was not Merrick's own memory, but carried the texture of memory, the weight and specificity of actual experience, moving behind his eyes for a moment, like a hand passing through water. Something was remembering through him. He removed the mask. He sat very still for a long time afterward. Then he wrote down exactly what had happened, in the precise and unemotional language he used for all his field documentation. He described the pressure. He described the quality of it. He wrote, "Not an attack, not a warning, more like a residue of attention that had not been fully discharged at the time of sealing." He did not put the mask on again. In the morning, he had a box made. He had brought materials for exactly this purpose, carved panels of dark wood that fit together without fasteners, tight enough to hold the mask immobile during transport. He placed the mask inside. He sealed the box. He carried it out of the tomb himself, without giving it to either of the students who had recovered enough to walk. The box sat in his collection for 150 years. Merrick studied it periodically, examining the exterior, rereading his field notes, attempting on several occasions to find a scholar who could read the early pre-classical script well enough to translate even a portion of the exterior glyphs. He found two who could attempt it. Neither produced a translation he trusted. He never opened the interior inscription to any scholar. That felt, for reasons he never articulated in his records, like something that should not be shared until it was understood. He died without understanding it. His estate passed to a successor who maintained the collection out of obligation rather than interest. The successor's successor had even less interest. By the time the Great Hyperspace War reached Merrick's world, 3 systems from Korriban, close enough to the front line of the Republic's counteroffensive that survival was never a reasonable expectation. The collection had been largely forgotten by anyone who might have moved it to safety. The Republic offensive hit the world on a day in a calendar that would not survive the war. The Citadel burned from the top down. The collection wing was on the 3rd level. The fire reached it in the early evening. The carved box that held the mask was on a shelf beside Ajunta Paul's sandstone tablet and the staff fragment from Carnus Moor and the 3 objects of uncertain attribution. The shelf collapsed. The box tumbled through the gap where the floor had been. and fell through darkness and heat and collapsed stone until it hit the basement level with a force that split the wood panels entirely. The mask skidded across the stone floor of the basement and struck the far wall. The crack formed along the left cheekbone, a hairline fracture, clean and precise, running from just below the eye opening to the edge of the jaw. Then the ceiling came down, and the mask was in the dark. And above it, the Sith Empire and the Republic were in the process of rewriting the galaxy in ways that neither of them would fully understand for centuries. The mask did not know any of this. It lay in the dark and held its crack and waited for whatever came next. The war had been over for 6 months. That was enough time for the bodies to be cleared. Enough time for the Republic fleet to establish patrol routes through the former Sith territories. Enough time for Naga Sato to vanish into the Outer Rim and become someone else's future problem. It was not enough time to understand what the Sith had been. 2,000 years of civilization. 2,000 years of dark side tradition, of alchemy and scholarship, and a culture that had grown from the collision of 8 Jedi exiles with a species that had been Force-sensitive since before the Republic existed. All of it now rubble. All of it now scattered personnel and unanswered questions, and 1,000 sealed rooms that nobody had opened yet. Someone had to go through what remained. The surviving Sith administrators, the ones who had surrendered rather than fled, who had calculated correctly that cooperation was a better survival strategy than resistance, were doing what administrators always do when everything above them collapses. They were filing reports, inventory lists, asset registers, documentation of what had existed and what remained. Not loyalty, not grief. Just the bureaucratic instinct that outlasts every political structure, the deep, persistent need to have things written down before they disappear entirely. One of those administrators sent a scholar to document the ruins of what had once been Merrick's holdings. The scholar of the 3rd expedition. That is all the surviving records give him. One designation on one inventory list. Whatever his name was, whatever world he came from, whatever he had been before the war, reduced everything around him to rubble. None of it survived the 11 minutes that ended his life near the Stygian caldera. Only his work survived briefly. He had been doing salvage documentation for 3 months when he reached the world where Merrick's citadel had stood. The same dry wind that blew across every world in this region of space met him when he stepped off his transport. The same red-tinged dust that Korriban sent outward through the systems around it settled on his clothing before he reached the ruins. The citadel had been collapsing for 3 years. The upper levels were gone entirely, not damaged, absent, dissolved into compacted rubble. The lower level had held. His team spent a day clearing access. On the 2nd day, he went down with a lamp. He had been in enough ruined buildings to know what he was looking for. He found it in the far corner of the basement. A scatter of objects across a wide area. Shelf collapse from significant height. He could read the debris pattern the same way the scholar of the mask's 2nd chapter could read an injury. The carved box that had held the mask was splinters. The wood had not survived the impact or the 3 years since. What had been inside was lying 6 feet from the largest concentration of debris, face down, on the stone floor. He picked it up. He turned it over. The crack along the left cheekbone caught his lamp immediately. The same hairline fracture that had formed when the box hit the basement wall. The same clean line running from below the eye opening to the edge of the jaw. It was the first thing anyone noticed about the mask now. Before the exterior glyphs, Before the depth of the obsidian surface, the crack announced itself. He examined the exterior glyphs next. He could read classical Sith script, the forms that had been in standard use for the past several centuries of the Empire. What was carved on the exterior of this mask was older than anything in his training. He recognized the family. He could feel, the way any Force-sensitive person feels, the age of accumulated objects, that this predated almost everything else he had handled in 3 months of salvage work. He turned the mask over and looked at the interior. He went still. The glyphs inside were the same pre-classical family as the exterior, same approximate period, same ancient notation system, but written with something different, finer, more controlled. A precision instrument rather than a craftsman's tool. The kind of instrument a healer might carry, small enough for exact work, designed for incisions, not broad cuts. And the hand was different. The exterior had been carved by a craftsman following instructions. The interior had been written by the person who owned the mask. He was certain of this, with the particular certainty that comes from handling enough old objects to recognize the difference between a scribe's hand and an author's hand. Someone had written their own thoughts on the inside of this mask, in a script he could not read, with a tool they carried themselves. He wrote all of this in his field notes. He noted the crack. He noted the age. He noted the distinction between interior and exterior inscriptions. He flagged the object separately from the rest of the salvage, wrapped it in cloth from his own supply case rather than the standard collection material, placed it in his personal documentation crate rather than the general recovery boxes. He found other objects in the debris around it. A sandstone tablet, cracked in 3 places, that carried resonance strong enough to feel from 2 feet away. A staff fragment, lower third only, metal fittings intact, the wood around them partially burned. 3 objects of uncertain attribution in varying degrees of damage. He catalogued everything. Then he filed his preliminary report and boarded a vessel heading for Korriban to submit the full documentation to the surviving Sith administrative office. He did not reach Korriban. The Republic patrol found the vessel near the edge of the Stygian caldera. Standing orders in the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War were clear. Any Sith vessel in former Sith territory was to be treated as a potential threat. Documentation vessels, administrative transports, medical ships. It did not matter what they were carrying or what their apparent purpose was. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Somewhere in those 11 minutes, the scholar of the 3rd expedition died. His field notes survived because they were in a sealed documentation case that the Republic boarding party pulled intact from the debris of the vessel's interior. His inventory list survived because it existed in duplicate 1 copy on the vessel, 1 copy already submitted to an administrative office on a world the Republic occupied 3 weeks later. That is how his designation survived. The scholar of the 3rd expedition. 1 name on 1 list. Nothing more. The Republic boarding party transferred everything recovered from the vessel to their patrol ship. Eventually, it reached a processing facility on Coruscant. Eventually, a crate containing the scholar's personal documentation case and collection materials was assigned to an archivist in the Republic's post-war recovery division. The archivist was efficient. She had been processing recovered Sith materials for 4 months. She had developed the triage instinct that the work required rapid assessment, essential documentation, move to the next object. The Republic Archive was processing thousands of recovered items from across the former Sith territories. There was no time for deep study of any single piece. There was only time for the note that might, someday, allow someone else to study it properly. She picked up the mask. She turned it over in her hands. She felt the weight of it more than the stone alone accounted for. The same weight that XoXaan had felt when she first wore it. The same weight that Merrick had noted in the one line of his field records that described lifting it. The archivist did not know about XoXaan. She did not know about Merrick. She knew only that the object was heavier than it looked, and that the obsidian surface had a quality she had not seen before, a depth to the darkness that shifted as she moved it under her lamp. She examined the exterior glyphs, pre-classical Sith notation, too old for her to read. Style consistent with early exile period. She had enough training to place the approximate period, not enough to translate the content. She examined the interior. She noted the finer instrument, the different hand. She noted that the interior inscription appeared to have been written by the maker rather than copied by a craftsman. She noted the crack along the left cheekbone. She wired a copper-colored catalog tag to the lower edge of the mask. The tag was stamped with a number in her current sequence, a number that corresponded to a central archive record that would be reorganized twice in the following century, cross-referenced incorrectly once, and eventually migrated to a storage system that no longer existed in any recoverable form. She wrote her note in the record. Sith ceremonial object, purpose unknown, circa early Sith period, pre-classical inscription, interior and exterior, translation not possible with current references, recommend specialist review. She placed the mask in a storage crate with 11 other objects from the same recovered collection. She sealed the crate. 2 archival workers carried it to a sub-level storage room, a long corridor of identical sealed crates, floor to ceiling, stretching further than the lamplight reached in either direction. They set it down. One of them noted the location in the corridor register. The other turned off the lamp. The footsteps receded down the corridor. The lock clicked, and the mask was in the dark. Again, different dark from Merrick's collapsed basement. Different dark from XoXaan's sealed tomb, but dark all the same. The copper tag on its lower edge held a number that meant nothing to anyone now. The crack along its cheekbone held the darkness the way cracks always do, collecting it, keeping it. Outside the archive, the Republic was rebuilding. Speeches were being made about the end of the Sith threat. The Jedi were filing their own reports, assessments of what the war had revealed about dark side capability, recommendations for how the Order should respond to the knowledge that 2,000 years of Sith civilization had been developing out past the caldera, while the Republic assumed the problem was solved. Inside the sub-level storage room, none of this was audible. The specialist review that the archivist had recommended did not happen that year. It did not happen the following year. The Republic had just fought a war. There were more urgent things than a ceremonial object of uncertain purpose recovered from a destroyed Sith estate. The queue for specialist review grew longer. The mask stayed in the dark. It had been in the world for approximately 2,000 years. It had been made by a healer on a red desert world that the Republic had never heard of at the time of its making. It had been worn twice, once by its maker, once by a scholar who felt something remembering through him and never wore it again. It had survived a war that destroyed the civilization that produced it. Now it was on Coruscant, mislabeled, waiting for a specialist review that would never come. On Korriban, 3 systems away, XoXaan's tomb sat exactly as it had been left. The stand, still there, the low table, the sealed containers of her medical instruments. The stand held nothing. It had held nothing for over 1,000 years. The mask that had rested on it was in a crate, in a corridor, on a world XoXaan had never seen. carrying a copper tag with a number that corresponded to no surviving record system. 4,000 years would pass before anyone opened that crate again. The lock clicked, the footsteps faded, the corridor went dark, and nothing happened. That is the truth of what followed. For years, then decades, then centuries, nothing happened to the mask. No one came for it. No one opened the crate. No one walked down that particular sub-level corridor with any intention related to catalog number stamped on the copper tag wired to its lower edge. The galaxy happened everywhere else, not here. In the first century after the lock clicked, the Republic rebuilt itself. The Great Hyperspace War had been the largest conflict the Republic had ever fought, larger than anything in the previous 1,000 years of its history, larger than anything most of its citizens could have imagined before Naga Sadow's fleets crossed the Stygian caldera and made imagination unnecessary. The rebuilding was slow. Border systems that had been caught between the two advancing fronts needed years of reconstruction. Populations that had been displaced needed resettling. The Republic's military, which had been expanded rapidly and drastically during the war, needed to be reduced to a size the Senate could afford to maintain, without the emergency appropriations that only active conflict justifies. The Jedi rebuilt too. Their understanding of the Sith had been wrong fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. 2,000 years of assuming the problem was solved, that the exiles had died in the unknown regions, that the dark side tradition, the Order, had spent a century fighting, had ended with the exile itself. 2,000 years of being incorrect, while the thing they thought was dead was building an empire 3 systems past the edge of their charts. They wrote new assessments. They revised their threat evaluations. They sent scholars to Korriban. XoXaan's tomb was entered for the first time by Jedi researchers approximately 40 years after the Great Hyperspace War ended. They found the stand. They found the low table, the sealed containers of her medical instruments, the stacked records pressed between flat stones. They documented everything carefully. They noted the stand beside her former sleeping area and the circular impression on its surface where something had rested for a long time, the obsidian worn slightly smooth in a shape consistent with the base of a ceremonial object. They noted that whatever had rested there was gone. They assumed it had been taken during the war, looted by one side or the other, lost in the chaos of the Republic's counteroffensive. They wrote this in their report. They were not wrong about the loss. They were wrong about the timing. The mask had been gone for over 1,000 years before the Great Hyperspace War began. Marek had taken it in the 214th year of the crossing. But no one reading the Jedi report knew about Marek. His records had burned with his citadel. His name did not appear in any Sith document that survived the war. He was as thoroughly erased from history as the scholar of the third expedition, 2 people who had held the mask and left no trace except the mask itself, which was currently in a crate on Coruscant that no one was thinking about. The Jedi report on XoXaan's tomb was filed in the Coruscant archives, 3 levels above where the mask was stored. The 2nd century passed. Then the 3rd. The Republic settled into the long, complicated peace that follows wars that end without resolving the underlying conditions that caused them. The Sith were gone, shattered, scattered, their empire dismantled. But the dark side tradition that XoXaan had helped build was not the kind of thing that disappeared because its institutional structure had been destroyed. It was knowledge. It lived in documents, in artifacts, in the memories of survivors who passed what they knew to students who passed it further. The Sith tradition fractured after the Great Hyperspace War. Then it reformed. Then it fractured again. In the sub-level corridor on Coruscant, none of this was visible. The corridor had been reorganized once in the 2nd century, a new cataloging system, new location markers, the corridor register updated and cross-referenced with the central archive. The crate containing the mask was moved 6 feet to the left to accommodate the new organization scheme. The number on the copper tag was transcribed into the new system, linked to the old record, flagged as pre-classical Sith period, ceremonial, translation pending. Translation still pending. The Mandalorian Wars began approximately 1,000 years after the lock clicked. The Republic had not expected them. The Republic had been managing its eastern borders and its internal politics, and the slow, persistent problem of dark side cults that kept emerging in the Outer Rim organizations that claimed the Sith mantle, that recovered fragments of Sith knowledge from the ruins of the old empire, that attracted the desperate and the angry and the genuinely powerful, and then collapsed under the weight of their own internal violence before becoming a serious threat. The Mandalorians were not a dark side cult. They were something the Republic understood, even less a warrior culture with resources and discipline, and a specific grievance about the Republic's refusal to engage with the conflict already consuming the Outer Rim. They moved fast. They hit hard. They drew the Republic into a war it had not prepared for. The Jedi Order divided over how to respond. Most of the Order counseled patience, caution, working within the Republic's political and military structure rather than acting independently. A faction disagreed. That faction was led by 2 knights named Revan and Malak. They took 1/3 of the Order's active members and went to fight the Mandalorians without the Council's blessing. They won. The Mandalorian Wars ended. Revan and Malak returned as heroes. Then they disappeared beyond the Outer Rim. Then they came back as Sith Lords. The Jedi Civil War that followed was the most destructive conflict the Republic had experienced since the Great Hyperspace War. Darth Revan's Sith Empire assembled with terrifying speed. From the remnants of the Mandalorian war machine and the Republic personnel who had followed him into the unknown regions, hit the Republic from a direction with a capability that its defenses were not configured to handle. The Coruscant archives were evacuated twice during the Jedi Civil War. The first evacuation was a precaution. Revan's forces had not yet reached Coruscant, but the possibility was being taken seriously. Archive personnel moved the most sensitive collections to protected sublevels. The crate containing the mask was already in a sublevel. It did not move. The second evacuation was not a precaution. Revan's forces reached Coruscant. The battle above the planet lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, 3 sections of the upper archive complex took structural damage from debris impacts. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that reached the sublevels, but enough to crack the ceiling of the corridor, 2 levels above where the mask was stored, and leave a water stain on the wall that would still be visible centuries later. The mask was in the dark through all of it. The battles above, the evacuations, the fall of Darth Revan captured by the Jedi, his memories stripped, remade as a tool against the empire he had built. The continued war under Darth Malak. The final engagement above Lehon where Malak died, and the war ended with a completeness that surprised everyone who had lived through it. The lock on the sub-level corridor had not been touched. Revan's Sith Empire collapsed after Malak's death. The surviving Sith scattered. The Republic began another reconstruction, slower this time, more exhausted. The cumulative weight of 2 major wars in 1,000 years, sitting heavily on institutions that had been designed for maintenance rather than repeated crisis. The Jedi Order rebuilt. XoXaan's name appeared in Sith documents recovered after the Jedi Civil War, fragments of the old Empire's records, texts that Revan's scholars had collected during their time in the unknown regions, references to the founding period that the Republic's own archives had never fully documented. Her tomb on Korriban was entered again. The stand was still there. The circular impression was still there. Researchers who visited noted that the impression had not changed. Whatever had rested on the stand had been removed long before any of the recent conflicts, long enough ago that the stone showed no sign of recent disturbance. 3 levels above the crate, in the active archive, a new file was opened on XoXaan. It cross-referenced her tomb documentation, the fragments of her healing doctrine that had survived in secondary sources, the references to her in recovered Sith texts. It did not cross-reference the crate. No one knew to look. 300 years of relative peace followed. Then the Great Galactic War. The true Sith Empire, the one that had been rebuilding in the unknown regions for 1,000 years, patient and methodical, and completely invisible to Republic intelligence, until it chose not to be crossed back into known space and hit the Republic with a force that made Revan's campaign look like a border skirmish. The sacking of Coruscant. The Jedi Temple burned. The archive was not the temple, it was a separate complex, several kilometers away, but the fires that burned across Coruscant during the sacking reached portions of the archival district. The sub-level where the mask was stored did not burn. The levels above it sustained smoke damage. Water used to fight the fires above seeped into the upper archive and damaged several thousand documents before the drainage systems managed it. The Treaty of Coruscant ended the immediate conflict. The Cold War that followed lasted decades, a long, careful, mutually exhausting standoff between a republic that could not afford another war and a Sith empire that had not yet rebuilt enough to finish the one it had started. During the Cold War, the Republic reorganized the archive again, third reorganization since the lock had clicked. The crate was moved again, same corridor, different position, 6 feet in the other direction, from where it had been placed during the second reorganization. The record was updated. The cross-references were checked. The flag for translation pending was still there, still pending. The Great Galactic War resumed, then ended. Then the aftermath, and the slow collapse of the Sith Empire that had started it, and the fragmentation of the dark side tradition into the competing factions and petty lordships and violent internal politics that characterized the new Sith Wars. 2,000 years after the Jedi Civil War, 3,000 years after the lock clicked, the galaxy was a different shape from what it had been when the archivist sealed the crate. Different borders, different governments, different crises. The Republic that had won the Great Hyperspace War and the Republic that was now fighting the new Sith Wars shared a name and a Senate building, and not much else. The institutions had been reformed, dissolved, rebuilt, reformed again so many times that the continuity was more symbolic than structural. The Sith tradition had been through the same process on the other side. XoXaan's healing doctrine, the thing the mask had been built to support, the practice it had been designed to anchor, existed now only in the most fragmentary secondary sources. The technique she had developed, the precise dark side healing methodology she had documented so carefully on the interior of the mask and in the stacked records in her tomb, had simplified across the generations into something barely recognizable as what she had originally created. The nuance was gone. The theoretical framework was gone. What remained was a rough, dark side healing practice that worked often enough to persist but bore the same relationship to XoXaan's original work that a folk remedy bears to the clinical research it was once derived from. Her name was Legend. Her tomb was a pilgrimage site. Her mask was in a crate on Coruscant. No one alive knew these three facts simultaneously. The new Sith wars were consuming everything. The Republic was stretched militarily, economically, institutionally. Security protocols that had been maintained for centuries were being suspended, reduced, deprioritized in favor of the more immediate problem of a war that was eating worlds. The Coruscant archives had reduced its security staff by 40%. Access protocols for the sub-level storage corridors, which required two-person authorization and a logged entry during normal operations, had been reduced to single-person authorization and spot check. Logging. There were not enough personnel to maintain the old standard. Someone noticed this. The sub-level was accessed on a night when the spot check roster showed no scheduled inspection. The entry was not logged. The person who entered was not identified by any surviving record. No name, no species, no affiliation, no stated purpose. What the records show is a gap. A period of approximately 2 hours during which access logs show an anomaly, a door opened that should not have been opened, a sequence of crate movements that the automated tracking system recorded without flagging because the flagging threshold had been adjusted as part of the security reduction. 2 hours. Systematic. Whoever it was knew what they were looking for, or knew what they were looking for well enough to recognize it when they found it. The crate was opened. The mask was removed. The thief paused. The automated system recorded a stationary period of 4 minutes near the crate's position, long enough to examine something, long enough to make a decision about it. Then movement toward the exit. Then the door. Then nothing. The next morning, an archivist doing a routine check of the sub-level found the opened crate. He documented the break-in carefully. He noted the missing object cross-referencing the crate's contents against the catalog record, identifying the mask by its description and its flag for translation pending. He filed a theft report. He noted in his report that the copper-colored catalog tag had been pulled from the object and left behind on the floor of the corridor. He was wrong about the tag. He would not know he was wrong. The tag was not on the floor. Something else was on the floor, a small piece of cloth, dark-colored, the kind used to wrap objects during transport, dropped in the process of removing the mask from the crate. The archivist, in the low light of the corridor, had misidentified it. The copper tag was still wired to the lower edge of the mask. It had gone with the thief. It had gone wherever the mask was going. The crate sat open in the corridor. The circular space where the mask had rested for 4,000 years held nothing now but the ghost of its shape, a slight compression in the padding material, the outline of an object that had been there long enough to leave an impression. The corridor was quiet. The report was filed, and the mask carrying its crack, its interior inscription, its accumulated resonance, its copper tag with a number that corresponded to no surviving record system, was moving through the galaxy again for the first time in 4,000 years. Toward Korriban, back to where it began. Korriban remembered everything. That was the quality of it, the thing that struck anyone Force-sensitive who set foot on the planet for the first time. Not the red stone, not the dry wind, not the scale of the valley where the ancient tombs were cut into the cliff faces. Those things were visible from the moment of landing. The memory was something else. It was in the ground, in the air, in the particular quality of silence that settled over the valley at night when the wind dropped and the darkness came down, complete and total and full of something that was not quite sound and not quite presence, but was unmistakably both. Korriban had been accumulating dark side resonance for longer than the Republic had existed. XoXaan had contributed to that accumulation. So had every Dark Lord who had come after her, every tomb cut into the valley walls, every ritual performed in the chambers beneath, every death, and there had been thousands of deaths on Korriban, deliberate and otherwise, across 4,000 years of Sith civilization using this world as its spiritual center. The mask had been part of that accumulation once. Now it was back. How it traveled from the broken archive on Coruscant to a secondary chamber adjacent to XoXaan's tomb is not recorded anywhere. The thief who removed it from the crate was never identified. No name, no species, no affiliation confirmed by any surviving document. The theft report filed by the archivist the morning after described the missing object and noted the apparent methodology: systematic, knowledgeable, someone who understood what they were looking for, and was then filed in a security queue that was deprioritized 3 weeks later when a Brotherhood of Darkness offensive consumed 3 Republic border systems and made an archive. Theft seemed like exactly the kind of minor problem that would have to wait. The queue was never cleared. The report was never followed up. The mask simply disappeared from Republic records and reappeared weeks or months later on Korriban, carried by hands that left no documentation, through a journey that left no record, arriving at a destination that suggested whoever had taken it understood more about what it was than the archivist's note had captured. Someone had known. Someone had known enough to take it from Coruscant and bring it home. But that someone was gone by the time the mask reached its destination, and what they knew went with them into whatever silence had claimed them. The acolyte arrived on Korriban 3 days after the mask. She was young, not a child, but close enough to it that anyone looking at her would have used the word without hesitation. She had been with the Brotherhood of Darkness for 2 years. Her master was a mid-ranking lord named Vashti who had enough political instinct to recognize, in the final weeks of the new Sith Wars, that the Brotherhood was losing, not losing the war, losing itself. The Brotherhood of Darkness had been consuming its own members for years: internal purges, political executions, the particular violence of a dark side organization that had never resolved the question of who was actually in charge. Lord Khan led it in name. In practice, it was a collection of powerful individuals who cooperated just enough to fight the Republic and competed just enough to destroy each other when the Republic wasn't immediately in front of them. Vashti had read this correctly. He had sent his acolyte to Korriban with specific instructions. Go to the Valley of the Dark Lords. Enter the ancient tombs. Recover whatever survived from the founding period: artifacts, documents, objects of power that predated the Brotherhood's internal politics and might retain value regardless of what happened next. Bring back what she could carry. He had said, before the final battles consume everything. He had not said what he expected those final battles to consume. He died at Ruusan 3 weeks after she arrived on Korriban. The Brotherhood of Darkness died with him, or rather, died because of him. Because Lord Khan detonated a thought bomb in the Valley of the Jedi that killed every Force-sensitive being present on both sides, Brotherhood and Army of Light alike. A weapon of absolute destruction, a final act that ended the new Sith Wars by ending everyone fighting them. The rule of 2 began in the aftermath of that silence. Darth Bane walked away from Ruusan alone and began remaking the Sith Order from the ground up, 2 at a time, master and apprentice, the chain unbroken from that point forward. The acolyte on Korriban knew none of this yet. She was in a secondary chamber adjacent to XoXaan's original tomb, holding a lamp in one hand and looking at an obsidian mask she had found on the stone floor. She had been working through the secondary chambers for a week. XoXaan's main tomb had been entered many times. She could tell from the worn stone around the outer door, the evidence of multiple sealing and unsealing operations across what looked like centuries of intermittent access. She had gone in briefly, documented what was there, and moved on. What interested her were the chambers adjacent to the main tomb, smaller spaces, less visited, the kind of rooms that got overlooked when people were focused on the primary burial site. This chamber was the third one she had entered. It was small, low ceiling, a single entrance. The floor was flat stone, except for a slight depression near the far wall where something heavy had rested for a very long time, a circular impression, faint but visible to someone looking for it. The mask was not in the depression. It was on the floor nearby, set down carefully, not dropped, placed by someone who had taken a moment to position it deliberately before leaving. The coppered tag on its lower edge caught her lamp's light first, then the obsidian surface, then the crack along the left cheekbone. She picked it up. She was not a scholar. Her training had been practical force techniques, combat applications, the political navigation required to survive inside the Brotherhood's hierarchy. She could not read Sith script of any period. The glyphs on the exterior of the mask were shapes to her. Interesting shapes, old shapes, but not language she could access. She turned the mask over and looked at the interior. The glyphs inside were denser than the exterior ones, written with something fine and precise. She could feel, even without being able to read them, that they were different in nature, from the exterior more personal, more urgent, the marks of someone recording something they needed to have recorded. She brought the mask close to her face to examine the interior glyphs by lamplight. Not wearing it, just looking. Her face was perhaps 2 inches from the interior surface, and she felt it. Not the pressure behind the eyes that Merrick had described. She had no record of Merrick to compare against, no framework for what she was experiencing. She felt it as a temperature change first. The air inside the mask was colder than the air in the chamber, not the cold of stone, something else. Then the temperature change became something more directional, not cold from a source, but cold toward a destination, as though something inside the mask was drawing heat rather than lacking it. Then, for a moment that lasted less than a breath, she felt observed, not threatened, not attacked, observed with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who is very still and very focused, and has been waiting for a long time. She lowered the mask. She stood in the chamber for a moment without moving. Then she set the mask down on the floor carefully, deliberately, and sat against the wall across from it, and looked at it for a long time without picking it up again. She was still on Korriban when the news reached her. A surviving Brotherhood member, one of the few who had not been at XoXaan, who had been on a resupply mission when the thought bomb detonated, landed on Korriban 2 weeks after the battle. He was in poor condition. He had the particular look of someone who had received information that had removed several of the assumptions their life was built on. He told her what had happened at XoXaan. Lord Khan, the thought bomb, the Army of Light, everyone. He left the next morning on the same ship that had brought him. He offered her a place on it. She declined. She was not certain in that moment why she declined. She told herself it was because she had not finished what Vashti had sent her to do, that the work of documentation was incomplete, and she owed it to her master's instructions to finish it, even if her master was dead. and the organization he served was destroyed. This was partially true. The other part was the chamber, the mask on the floor, the feeling of being observed by something that had been waiting for a very long time and had not yet finished waiting. She could not explain this to the surviving Brotherhood member. She was not sure she could explain it to herself. So she stayed. She documented 3 more chambers in the following weeks. She ate what she had brought and supplemented it with what Korriban's harsh landscape offered, which was not much. She slept in the outer passage of XoXaan's main tomb, because it was the most protected space she had found, and because the dark side resonance there was strong enough to provide a kind of company that she had stopped finding disturbing and started finding simply true. She returned to the secondary chamber regularly, not to study the mask, not to attempt to read the glyphs. She returned because the chamber had a quality that she could not name and had stopped trying to name a quality of accumulated presence, of significance that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what had been here before her. She held the mask twice more. Both times she felt the same thing, the cold that was not cold, the observation that was not threat. Both times she set it down afterward and sat across from it and thought about what it would mean to carry it with her. She never carried it. There was nowhere to carry it to. The Brotherhood was gone, her master was gone. The Sith Order that she had understood herself to be part of was in the process of being remade by someone she had never met, according to principles she had never been taught, in a form that would not have room for mid-ranking acolytes who had spent the final weeks of the new Sith Wars on Korriban cataloging secondary chambers. The mask belonged here more than she did. That was the thought she settled on. Eventually, not as philosophy, not as reverence, but as practical assessment. She had no ship. She had no master. She had no organization to return to, and no destination that made sense. The mask had been here, in this valley, in one form or another, since before the Republic had heard of Korriban. Whatever she did, wherever she went, this was where it would end up. She left it on the floor of the secondary chamber. She did not survive the year. Korriban was not a world that sustained people who were alone and without resources and without a ship and without a clear plan for how to get off it. She lasted longer than she should have. The dark side resonance of the valley sustained her in ways that had nothing to do with food or water, kept her functional past the point where the arithmetic of her supplies said she should have stopped being functional. But arithmetic is patient. It always collects eventually. She died in the outer passage of XoXaan's main tomb, in the same spot where she had been sleeping for months. She did not die dramatically. She simply stopped, the way people stop when they have used everything they have and there is nothing left to use. Her body remained where it was. Korriban did not disturb its dead. Decades passed. A Sith scholar entered the secondary chamber adjacent to XoXaan's tomb on a research expedition sometime in the century after Ruusan. He was working under the early rule of 2, not one of the 2, not master or apprentice, but an independent scholar who had dedicated his life to recovering what the new Sith Wars had destroyed or scattered. He found the acolytes' remains in the outer passage of the main tomb. He documented them briefly: species, approximate age at death, no identifiable possessions, and moved on to what he had come for. In the secondary chamber, he found the mask. He recognized it immediately as a significant object: the age of the obsidian, the style of the exterior glyphs, the crack along the left cheekbone, the copper-colored tag on its lower edge that corresponded to no archival system he recognized. He spent 3 hours in the chamber with it. He could read more of the exterior glyphs than any previous owner. The Rule of Two's emphasis on recovering and preserving ancient Sith knowledge had produced scholars with deeper access to pre-classical notation than the Brotherhood period had maintained. He translated approximately a third of the exterior inscription before his references ran out. What he translated confirmed what he had suspected from the moment he saw the glyph's style. He wrote in his own records, object consistent with founding period, possibly XoXaan's work. Exterior inscription appears to describe a healing methodology of significant sophistication. Interior inscription in unknown subsystem, not translatable with current references. Object to be left in situ, pending further study. He left it where it was. He left the acolyte's remains where they were too. He filed his report with his own archive, a private collection maintained in a location he kept deliberately obscure, and noted the chamber's coordinates for future study. The future study did not happen in his lifetime. The mask rested on the floor of the secondary chamber. The lamplight was gone. The acolyte was gone. The scholar was gone. The silence of the chamber settled back into itself, the same silence it had held before the acolyte arrived, before the thief had set the mask down carefully on the stone floor, before any of the hands that had carried it across 4,000 years of galactic history had ever touched it. But it was not the same silence as the Coruscant archive. The archive had been the silence of storage, the silence of a thing forgotten. The silence of a catalog number on a copper tag in a crate in a corridor where the lamp had been turned off and no one was coming. This was different. This was Korriban. The dark side ran through the stone beneath the floor. It ran through the valley walls. It ran through the air that came down cold at night from the plateaus above the tombs. It had been running through this specific valley for longer than any record could account for. The mask sat in it the way a stone sits in a river, taking what the current brought, holding it, waiting not with intention, not with awareness, but with the specific patience of an object that had already survived everything and had no reason to expect the next thing would be different. Outside the secondary chamber, the rule of two was remaking the Sith Order, one careful generation at a time. The Republic was rebuilding from the new Sith Wars. The XoXaan reformations were restructuring the Republic's military and the Jedi Order's relationship to it. History was moving at its usual pace, too fast for the people living through it, too slow for the people waiting on the other side. The mask held the crack along its left cheekbone. It held the copper tag. It held the interior inscription in a script almost no one living could read. It held the cold observation that the acolyte had felt when she brought her face close to its surface, the presence of something that had been waiting since before the new Sith Wars began, since before the Jedi Civil War, since before the Great Hyperspace War had shattered the first Sith Empire and sent everything that survived it scattered across the galaxy. The chamber was dark. The mask was still. Korriban breathed around it, in the way Korriban always breathed, slow, deep, full of everything it had accumulated and unwilling to release any of it. Somewhere far above, in a galaxy moving through its latest crisis, the rule of two was being written. Here, in the secondary chamber, the light that the acolyte's lamp had made was long gone, and in the dark, the mask simply was, as it had always simply been waiting for the next lamp to be lit. There is a gap in the mask's history. Not the gap of the Coruscant archive. That gap was documented, catalogued, given a number and a flag and a corridor location. That gap had the shape of bureaucratic neglect. It was the gap of something forgotten, which is a kind of gap the galaxy produces constantly and understands well. This gap is different. This gap has no catalog entry, no theft report, no field notes from a scholar who found it afterward and tried to reconstruct what had happened. This gap exists in the window between the thief leaving the Coruscant archive with the mask and the mask arriving on Korriban, a window of weeks or months, a period of transit that should have left some trace somewhere and did not. What happened in that window is not recorded. What the mask carried afterward, what it carried from that window into everything that followed, is the only evidence that anything happened at all. The world has no name in any current map. It may have had a name once. Most worlds do. Eventually, even the uninhabited ones get designations, survey numbers, catalog entries, in the Republic's expansive and imperfect record of what exists in the galaxy. But if this world was ever surveyed, the record did not survive whatever destroyed the civilization that made it. If it was ever named, the name went with whoever named it. What remains is the world itself, a continent with no name, a landscape that looks, from the air, like a place that was once something else. The geometry of the terrain is wrong in ways that suggest intervention rather than geology. Valleys that are too straight, plateaus that are too flat, and at the center of the continent, a crater, not made by any weapon, not made by any impact, made by something that the landscape around it has been oriented toward for longer than any current civilization has existed. The rock at the crater's edge is different from the rock further away, not in composition, but in quality. It has a density to it, a weight of accumulated something that has nothing to do with its mineral content. For sensitive individuals who came close to this crater, in the rare cases when anyone came close to it at all, described the experience differently, depending on their tradition and their training. Jedi who encountered it spoke of a stillness that was deeper than the stillness of meditation. Sith who encountered it spoke of a pressure that was older than the dark side. Individuals with no formal training who stumbled into its proximity often simply turned around and left without being able to explain why. What everyone agreed on, in the rare accounts that touched on this world at all, was that whatever the crater was, it was not new. It had been there before the Jedi existed, before the Sith existed, before the distinction between those two traditions had been invented by people who needed a way to describe the difference between two approaches to the same fundamental force. The mask arrived at the crater's edge before dawn. The sky above was dark, not the complete dark of a moonless night, but the particular dark of a sky that is beginning to consider becoming something else, the dark that has direction to it, even when it has no visible light. The stone at the crater's edge was cold under the carrying hands. Cold, in the way that stone near a nexus is always cold. Not the cold of temperature, but the cold of something, drawing heat toward itself continuously, a slow and permanent appetite. The carrying hands set the mask down at the crater's edge. They did not move away. They remained still, positioned in the specific posture of someone who has done this before, or has been told exactly how to do it by someone who has, not kneeling, not standing. Something between the two, a posture that distributed weight differently from either, that oriented the body in a direction that had nothing to do with compass points or cardinal directions. The mask sat on the stone. Its obsidian surface was facing upward. The interior glyphs, XoXaan's inscription, the theory she had written with a medical instrument, on the day the carver finished the exterior, faced the sky. The carrying hands withdrew, not far, just back from the crater's edge. What happened next is described here only in terms of what the mask experienced, not what was done to it, not who did it, not why, only what the mask, if a mask could be said to experience anything, held in its surface and its stone, and its accumulated resonance in the time that followed. The first thing was temperature. The cold that had always been present at the crater's edge became something different, not colder exactly, but more directional. It had been drawing heat from everything around it equally, the way a cold surface draws heat from warm air. Now it was drawing from one specific point, from the mask, from the obsidian and the glyphs and the copper tag and the crack along the left cheekbone, from all of it, specifically, as though the crater's appetite had identified a particular source and was now focused entirely on what that source contained. The second thing was sound, not audible sound, not the kind that travels through air and reaches ears and registers as vibration. Something beneath that, a frequency that the stone of the crater transmitted rather than the air above it. A resonance that was present in the ground and in the mask's obsidian surface, because obsidian is stone, and stone conducts what the ground carries. It was not a tone. It was not a rhythm. It was something that had both of those qualities without being either of them, something old enough that the categories of tone and rhythm had not yet existed when it was first produced. Something that predated the language for describing it. The mask held it. The third thing was attention. This is the hardest to describe and the most important. Attention has a quality when it is directed at you, a specific feeling of being the object of a focused awareness, of mattering to something that is registering your existence. Every previous owner of the mask had directed attention at it. XoXaan, examining it the morning it was finished. Merrick, studying it in the lamplight of the inner chamber. The scholar of the third expedition, turning it over in the basement of the destroyed citadel. The archivist on Coruscant, wiring the copper tag to its lower edge. Human attention, specific, bounded, originating from a single point of awareness. What was directed at the mask now was not that. It was not bounded. It did not originate from a single point. It came from the crater, not from anything in the crater, not from a presence that could be located in space, but from the crater itself, from whatever the crater was, from whatever had made the crater what it was, before any current civilization existed to observe it. It was slower than human attention. It was larger. It had the quality of something that had been observing the galaxy for long enough that the observation had become indistinguishable from the thing being observed, something that did not separate itself from what it was paying attention to, because the separation had long since dissolved. It paid attention to the mask for a duration that the mask had no way to measure, and that any human present would have experienced differently depending on how they related to the passage of time in this particular location. Then it stopped. When the attention withdrew, the crater's edge was silent. The cold returned to its baseline, drawing from everything equally again, no longer focused. The sound beneath hearing faded to the threshold where it was present, but not distinct present, the way it was always present at this location. Background, the hum of a place that had been accumulating something for a very long time. The mask was on the stone. The carrying hands returned to it. They lifted it. And the person holding it, whoever they were, whatever they were, whatever they had brought the mask here to accomplish, held it in the ambient light of the crater and looked at the interior. The glyphs were the same. They had not been changed, not rearranged, not added to. XoXaan's inscription was exactly as she had cut it with her medical instrument on the day the carver finished the exterior. In the same pre-classical notation system she had developed for concepts that no existing language could carry. But in the ambient light of the crater, the particular quality of light that existed at the nexus, neither dawn nor dark, something between the glyphs appeared to be lit from within, not glowing, not luminous, Nothing that would be visible in ordinary light. Something subtler, a quality of the stone in the places where the glyphs were cut that was different from the quality of the stone around them, as though the inscription had been recognized by something that recognized very little, and the recognition had left a trace. The carrying hands lowered the mask. They wrapped it in cloth. They carried it away from the crater's edge without looking back. The world did not record this. The world had no mechanism for recording anything. It had no inhabitants. It had no automated systems. It had the crater and the two straight valleys and the two flat plateaus and the stone that drew heat from everything near it. It kept doing this after the carrying hands left. It will continue doing this, presumably, for as long as it exists. The second layer was in the mask now. It was not dark side energy. It was not light side energy. It was not the Force as any tradition had codified it, not the Jedi understanding, not the Sith understanding, not the various intermediate traditions that had existed in the galaxy's long history and been absorbed or destroyed by one of the two major ones. It was older than those categories. It was the Force as it had existed before anyone had thought to divide it, before the Jedi had built a philosophy around one aspect and the Sith had built a philosophy around another, before the war between those philosophies had consumed centuries of galactic history and reshaped the galaxy's political and spiritual landscape so thoroughly that most people alive could not imagine the Force as anything other, the binary those traditions had constructed. XoXaan's layer was still there, the foundation, the oldest resonance, the dark side healing methodology, encoded in the interior glyphs and the accumulated contact of every person who had held the mask in the centuries since its making. The new layer was beneath that, beneath XoXaan, beneath the Sith tradition she had helped found, beneath the 100-year darkness and the exile and the original fall from the Jedi Order and all the history that had produced the person who commissioned the mask in the first place. It was beneath all of it, and it would confuse every Force-sensitive being who handled the mask from this point forward, not because it was threatening or overwhelming, but because it did not fit any framework they had been given. It was not dark. It was not light. It was simply present, the way ancient things are present, with the specific weight of something that has existed long enough that its existence has become a fact of the environment rather than an event within it. The carrying hands brought the mask to Korriban. The world recognized it, not in any way that could be documented or observed from the outside, not with any visible sign, not with any audible acknowledgement. But the dark side resonance that ran through Korriban's stone and soil and air had been accumulating for long enough that it had developed, if not awareness, then something that functioned like awareness in the specific narrow sense of registering the presence of significant objects. The mask had been made here. It had carried Korriban's resonance in its stone since the day XoXaan first wore it, and the ceremony she performed in the secondary chamber sent dark side energy into the obsidian surface in a way that became permanent. The world held what had been made in it. The carrying hands moved through the valley of the Dark Lords in the dark, no lamp, no light source, moving through the valley the way someone moves through a place they know well enough that vision is secondary. Past the sealed outer door of Zazan's main tomb, along the cliff face to the left, to the entrance of the secondary chamber. Inside, the floor was bare stone, the ceiling was low. The air was cold in the way that Korriban's air is always cold. In the enclosed chambers, the stone drawing heat from everything inside it, the dark side resonance adding its own particular chill to the baseline temperature. The mask was set down. not placed against the wall, not rested on any surface that elevated it, set directly on the floor, in roughly the center of the chamber, with a care and deliberateness that suggested this specific placement mattered to whoever was doing the placing. The carrying hands withdrew. The entrance to the secondary chamber was dark. Then it was empty. Then the footsteps in the valley outside faded, not quickly, not hurriedly, but with the steady pace of someone completing a task and moving on to whatever came next. The mask was on the floor. The second layer was in it. The crack was in it. The copper tag was on its lower edge. The interior inscription was in its stone, illuminated from within by something that had recognized it at the crater's edge and left a trace of that recognition in the places where the glyphs were cut. Korriban was around it. The silence of the valley settled over everything, not the silence of the Coruscant archive, not the silence of a forgotten crate in a sub-level corridor where the lamp had been turned off and no one was coming. The silence of Korriban, full, waiting. The same silence it had held since before XoXaan arrived, since before the 8 exiles landed, since before the Sith species had built the first structure in the valley that would eventually become the resting place of every Dark Lord who followed. The mask rested in it, and the valley breathed around it in the dark, and somewhere far away, on a world that would not appear in this story for another 1,000 years, a Muun banker was being born who would spend his life pursuing the secrets that XoXaan had locked inside the stone. The mask was made from, who would find the mask, read what she had written, understand more of it than anyone since its making, and die before he could share what he had learned. But that was 1,000 years away. For now there was only the chamber, the mask on the floor, the dark, and the second layer, settling into everything around it the way sediment settles into still water slowly, completely, and without any intention of ever coming back out. Darth Plagueis did not rush. That was the quality that defined him more than any other, more than his power, more than his intelligence, more than the specific obsession that had organized his entire adult life into a single, long project. He did not rush. He approached every problem the way a surgeon approaches a difficult procedure, with complete preparation, complete attention, and the particular patience of someone who understands that speed and haste are not the same thing, and that confusing them is how significant work gets ruined. He had been thinking about XoXaan for 20 years before he sent anyone to Korriban. Not exclusively, not obsessively, in the way that consumes other things. As one thread in a larger project, a thread he returned to periodically, pulling it a little further each time, adding what new information he had found to what he already knew, waiting until the picture was complete enough to act on. 20 years. Then he acted. What he knew about XoXaan came from 3 categories of source. The first was the standard historical record, the accounts of the founding period that had been preserved in Sith tradition across 7,000 years of transmission, degraded and simplified and filtered through the priorities of every generation that had copied and recopied them. These accounts agreed on the basic facts. XoXaan was one of the original 8 exiles. She had been a Jedi healer before the 100-year darkness. She had developed a dark side healing doctrine on Korriban that became foundational to early Sith practice. She had died approximately 2 centuries after the exile, been entombed in the Valley of the Dark Lords, and become one of the legendary figures of the founding period present in every account of those early years, specific in almost none of them. The second category was the fragmentary technical record documents written by XoXaan students and their students. Second and third generation accounts of her healing methodology that had been copied and recopied until the copies were copies of copies, each generation losing something that the previous one had understood imperfectly to begin with. Plagueis had read all of these. He had read them with the attention of someone who understood the subject well enough to identify what was missing, what the documents described around without describing directly, what the students had recorded without fully comprehending, what the copies had lost in the process of transmission. The gaps were significant. The original methodology, whatever XoXaan had actually developed, the complete theoretical framework, rather than the simplified applications her students had managed to document, was not present in any surviving text. What survived was effect without mechanism, technique without theory, the what incompletely remembered, without any of the why. The third category of source was the one that had taken Plagueis the longest to find. Fragmentary references in recovered Sith texts, obscure documents, poorly preserved, acquired over years of patient collection that pointed toward a physical artifact associated with XoXaan that had not been in her main tomb when the tomb was first studied. References that described an object made of obsidian, carved with pre-classical inscription, associated with the healing rites she had developed. References that placed this object not in the main tomb but in a secondary chamber adjacent to it. References that, when read together with the patience of someone who had been assembling this picture for 20 years, suggested the object was still there. The recovery agent he sent to Korriban was not a Sith. That was deliberate. Plagueis had no interest in sending someone whose force sensitivity might interact unpredictably with whatever the object carried. He wanted a professional, someone whose loyalty was financial rather than ideological, whose skills were archaeological rather than martial, whose instinct in the presence of significant objects was to preserve and transport rather than to use. He found the right person through 3 layers of intermediary, paid well enough that the layers of intermediary became irrelevant and gave precise instructions. The secondary chamber, the object described, handle with the provided materials. Do not unwrap it once it is wrapped. Deliver directly. The agent returned in 6 weeks. Plagueis received the wrapped object in his private study on Munilinst, a room designed for exactly this kind of work, with controlled light sources at multiple angles, a work surface calibrated for examining objects of various sizes, and the particular quality of silence that comes from a room that has been insulated against the sounds of the building around it. He set the wrapped object on the work surface. He did not unwrap it immediately. He examined it for 3 days before touching it directly. This was not excessive caution. This was method. The first day, he studied the exterior of the wrapping the cloth the agent had used, the way the object's shape displaced the fabric, what he could determine about dimensions and weight from observation alone. He made notes, precise, detailed, the kind of notes that would allow someone else to reconstruct his observations exactly. The second day, he unwrapped it, partially exposing the exterior surface of the obsidian without removing the interior wrapping. Examining the glyphs on the outside with a magnification instrument, he had developed himself for exactly this category of work. He could read pre-classical Sith script. He was one of perhaps 4 individuals alive who could read it at this level, not just recognize the family, not just approximate the period, but actually translate the specific notation system that the founding exiles had used in the first generation on Korriban, before the scribal tradition standardized. He translated the exterior inscription in approximately 2 hours. Then he sat with the translation for the rest of the second day. The exterior described a healing methodology. The theoretical framework was compressed, written for someone who already understood the basics. Not for a general audience, but it was present in a way that no surviving second-generation document had preserved. The mechanism was there, the why, which every copy had lost somewhere in 7,000 years of transmission, was there. He wrote nothing down that evening. He went to sleep and came back the next morning with fresh attention. The third day, he removed the remaining wrapping. The mask was exactly as the fragmentary references had described obsidian, pre-classical exterior inscription. The crack along the left cheekbone that several of the references had mentioned without explaining. The copper-colored tag on the lower edge puzzled him briefly until he recognized the archival format as Republic pre-XoXaan Reformation, which placed the object in Republic custody at some point before 1,000 years ago. And then he set the puzzle aside for later, because the interior was more immediately important. He turned the mask over. The interior glyphs were denser than the exterior, written with a finer instrument. The hand was different, more personal, more compressed. The marks of someone writing their own thought at speed rather than composing for transmission. He read it slowly. He was one of perhaps 4 people alive who could read the exterior inscription. He was possibly the only person alive who could read the interior one. The subsystem XoXaan had developed specifically for concepts that the standard pre-classical notation could not carry. The private language she had invented for the theoretical core of her work. He read it twice. Then he set the mask down on the work surface, face up, interior glyphs toward the ceiling. He sat in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. What he read is not recorded anywhere. He wrote nothing down that day. He produced no notes, no preliminary analysis, no indication in any document that has survived of what the interior inscription contained. The only evidence that he read it and understood it is behavioral, what he did in the weeks and months following that third day. The specific redirections in his research that can be traced in his records if you know what you are looking for. He had been pursuing the question of immortality from one direction for years. After the third day, he began pursuing it from a different direction, not abandoning the original approach, supplementing it, adding a new axis to the research that had not been present before, an axis that his records described only in the most oblique terms. In notation systems he had developed to prevent anyone reading his work from understanding it without his guidance. What XoXaan had written on the interior of the mask had given him something, not an answer. Plagueis was too careful a thinker to mistake a new piece of information for an answer to the question he had been asking, but a new way of approaching the question, a theoretical framework that predated everything he had previously been working from, that had been developed by someone who understood the relationship between the Force and living tissue in a way that the 7,000 years of Sith tradition following her had not preserved and had apparently not improved on. He worked from it for 4 years. The mask rested in a secondary collection room during those 4 years. Not the main study that was for active work, for documents and instruments and the objects he was currently engaging with directly. The secondary collection was for things he had finished with for the moment, things he intended to return to, things that had given him what he needed and were now waiting for the next question that would require them. He returned to the mask twice in those 4 years. Both times, He read the interior inscription again, not because he had forgotten it, but because his understanding of it had changed as his research developed, and reading it again at a different stage of his work produced different things. The second reading revealed implications that the first reading had not surfaced. The third reading revealed implications that the second had not surfaced. He suspected there were more implications beneath those. He intended to do a fourth reading. He did not get the opportunity. Darth Sidious killed him on a night in approximately 32 BBY. This was not a surprise, not in the abstract sense, not to anyone who understood the rule of two and its terminal logic. The apprentice kills the master. That is how the knowledge passes. That is how the chain continues. Plagueis understood this as well as anyone. He had killed his own master. He had known, from the moment Palpatine became his apprentice, that the relationship had an end built into its structure. He had believed, for reasons that his research had given him, that he could circumvent that end. He was wrong. The details of his death are not the mask's story. The mask was in the secondary collection room when it happened. The door closed, the room dark, the carefully organized shelves holding their objects in the silence that Plagueis had always maintained in that space. What matters for the mask's story is what happened afterward. Sidious Palpatine moved through Plagueis's estate with the systematic attention of someone who has been planning this for a long time. He knew what was in the main study. He knew the primary collection. He knew the research documents and the instruments and the objects that Plagueis had been actively working with. The secondary collection room was not on his list. Not because he forgot it, because his list had been compiled from his knowledge of Plagueis's active work, and the secondary collection was, by definition, the work Plagueis was not currently doing. It was the archive of things completed or set aside. Sidious had other priorities that night, and in the days that followed, the Trade Federation crisis was approaching. The pieces of the plan that would eventually produce the Empire were moving into their final positions, and the question of what was in his former master's secondary collection room could wait. It waited. The estate on Munilinst passed through several administrative transitions in the months after Plagueis's death-banking clan bureaucracy, the kind of institutional process that moves slowly and methodically and eventually touches everything, but not quickly. The secondary collection room was inventoried 8 months after Plagueis died by a banking clan administrator who had no force sensitivity and no knowledge of Sith artifacts, and no way to assess what she was looking at. She described the mask as decorative object, black stone, damaged, origin unknown. She assigned it a lot number. It was sold at a private estate liquidation to an antiquities dealer on Coruscant, who specialized in objects from the Outer Rim. The study where Plagueis had worked was still lit when the administrator arrived the morning after his death. The lights had been on all night. The automatic systems had not been triggered because no one had left the room through the normal exit, and the override that would have shut them down after a set period had been disabled years ago by someone who worked through the night often enough that automatic darkness was an inconvenience. An unfinished glass sat on the desk. His notes from the previous session were still open. The oblique notation, the private system, the research that no one else would be able to follow without guidance that no longer existed. The door to the secondary collection room was closed. The mask was inside. The flimsy translation that Plagueis had produced on the morning after the third day, folded carefully, placed inside the mask, left there for 4 years, was still inside the mask, still folded, still unshared. The lights in the study would stay on for another 6 hours before the building's backup systems finally registered the anomaly and corrected it. Then the study was dark. Then the whole estate was dark. And the mask was in the secondary collection room in the dark, carrying the translation of its own interior inscription inside itself, the only complete translation that had ever been produced, written by the only person in 1,000 years who had been able to read it, folded and placed inside, and never spoken of to anyone, waiting, as it always waited, for the next hands. Jocasta had learned, in the years since Order 66, to move like someone who was not there. Not invisibly, not with any force technique designed to deflect attention. That kind of active concealment left traces that Imperial sensors were increasingly calibrated to detect, something more ordinary than that. The particular quality of movement that belongs to people who have learned that the safest way to be somewhere you are not supposed to be is to look like you belong there completely and care about it not at all. She was good at it. She had been a librarian for most of her adult life. Librarians move through spaces with a specific kind of authority, not the authority of power, not the authority of rank, but the authority of someone who knows where everything is and is simply going to get it. That quality transferred, with some adjustment, to moving through an empire that would have killed her on sight if it had recognized her face. She kept her face unremarkable. She kept her pace steady. She kept moving. The contact who told her about the mask was a human woman named Sira, who ran a small documentation business in the lower levels of Coruscant's commercial district legitimate work, the kind that required access to antiquities, dealers and estate liquidators, and the various individuals who moved old objects through the city's informal markets. Sarah was not force-sensitive. She was not ideologically motivated. She was paid, carefully and consistently, to notice certain categories of object when they surfaced, and to notify a contact who would notify a contact who would eventually notify Jocasta. The notification that reached Jocasta described the object in terms Sarah had been given years ago: obsidian, pre-classical Sith inscription, old enough that the dealer couldn't date it with his standard references. Jocasta rerouted her current transit to include Coruscant. The dealer operated out of a narrow storefront in a district that had been middle market before the Empire and had become something harder to categorize since the kind of place where objects of uncertain provenance moved between people of uncertain affiliation without anyone asking too many questions about either. He was a careful man, not frightened exactly, but alert in the way that people become alert when their profession requires them to regularly handle things they do not fully understand. He had the mask in a back room. He brought it out wrapped in standard transport cloth and set it on the counter between them without unwrapping it, as though the unwrapping was something he preferred to do in the presence of a buyer rather than in advance. Jocasta looked at the wrapped object for a moment. Then she looked at him. She asked where it came from. He told her what he knew, which was not much. A Munilinst estate liquidation, part of a banking family's asset disposal, following the transition from Republic to Empire. The collection it had come from had been inventoried by someone with no specialist knowledge. The lot description had been almost useless, which was part of why it had come to him at a price that allowed him to ask the price he was currently asking. He named the price. Jocasta paid it without negotiation. This surprised him. He had prepared for negotiation. He had built a margin into the price, specifically to accommodate it. Her immediate agreement told him something about what she thought she was looking at, though he was careful not to say so, because that kind of observation was not useful to his continued health in the current political climate. He wrapped it back up and slid it across the counter. She took it and left. The safe location was 3 levels down and 4 districts over a small room she rented under a name that had no connection to any identity the Empire was looking for. She used it rarely. It had a work surface, a controlled light source, and the particular quality of silence that comes from a room surrounded by the noise of a city so dense that the noise cancels itself out. She set the mask on the work surface. She did not unwrap it immediately. She stood in the center of the room for a moment with her eyes closed, not meditating, not reaching into the Force for guidance, just settling, giving herself the 30 seconds of stillness that she had learned in the years since Order 66 to require of herself before handling anything significant. 30 seconds of absolute presence before the work began. Then she unwrapped it. The obsidian surface was the first thing. She had handled enough pre-classical Sith objects to know immediately that the material was authentic, not reproduced, not artificially aged, but genuinely old in the way that objects accumulate age in their molecular structure, rather than just their surface appearance. The depth of the black was real. The way it shifted in the light was real. The crack along the left cheekbone was the second thing. She examined it carefully, the angle, the clean precision of the fracture, the way it had settled over time into something permanent rather than propagating further. Impact damage. Old impact damage, old enough that the stone around it had fully stabilized. The crack had been there for a very long time. She turned to the exterior glyphs. She could read them. Not perfectly, her pre-classical Sith was strong but not complete, and the specific notation system on the exterior was at the older end of what her training covered. But she could read enough to confirm what she had already suspected from the material and the style. Founding period. Early exile settlement on Korriban. The first generation after the 100-year darkness, the period before the scribal tradition had standardized. When the 8 exiles and their immediate students were still developing the notation systems that would eventually become classical Sith script, she translated the exterior inscription slowly in her head without writing anything down. It described a healing methodology, not in general terms, in specific theoretical terms, the kind of precision that belonged to someone who had developed the technique from first principles rather than inherited it from a teacher. The mechanism was present. The why was present, not just the what. She read it twice. Then she set the mask down and stood back from the work surface and thought about what she had just read. She had known about XoXaan. Of course, she had known about XoXaan. She had been the chief librarian of the Jedi archives for decades, and XoXaan was one of the foundational figures of Sith history, present in every serious account of the founding period, referenced in every study of early Sith healing doctrine. She knew the standard historical record. She knew the fragmentary technical documents. She knew the gaps in the technical documents, the places where the second-generation copies had lost the mechanism and retained only the effect, where the theory had been simplified out of existence by students who had not understood it well enough to preserve it. She was looking at the thing that filled those gaps, the complete theoretical framework, the original, in the hand of the person who had developed it. She picked the mask up again and turned it over. The interior glyphs were denser than the exterior, written with a finer instrument, a medical tool, she thought, the kind of thing a healer would carry. The hand was different, more personal, more compressed. She could read the exterior's notation system, partially. The interior was different. It was the same family, the same general period, the same pre-classical Sith origin, but it was a subsystem she had not encountered before, more irregular, more personal. The notation of someone who had developed their own modifications to an existing system because the existing system could not carry what they needed to say. She translated perhaps a third of it, before her references ran out. What she translated was consistent with the exterior, more compressed, more theoretical, the deepest layer of the framework rather than its applications. She could see the shape of what she could not read. She could feel, in the way that a scholar who has spent decades with a subject feels the shape of a gap in the literature, that what she could not translate was the most significant part. She set the mask down. She looked at the lower edge. The copper-colored tag caught her attention immediately. Small, wired carefully to the obsidian, stamped with a number in a format she recognized after a moment's thought. Republic Archival Protocol, Pre-Rusan Reformation. She knew that format. She had used that format herself in the early years of her career, before the archival system had been updated to the standardized protocol that had been in use since the Reformations. The tag's style placed it before 1000 BBY, before the Brotherhood of Darkness, before the Rule of Two, before Darth Bane had destroyed and remade everything. The mask had been in Republic custody at some point before 1,000 years ago. She thought about this for a moment. Then she reached inside the mask, where the interior surface curved away from the cheekbone, and found the folded flimsy. It was thin, old, but not ancient. The material was a type that had been in common use for the past century or so, not the pre-classical material that would have matched the mask's age. Someone had placed this here recently. Recently, in the mask's terms, meant within the last 100 years. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was precise, controlled, in High Galactic, which was unusual for someone translating pre-classical Sith. Most scholars who worked at that level wrote their notes in whatever technical language their training had been in. High Galactic suggested someone who was accustomed to precision in their primary language, who trusted High Galactic to carry nuance the way a scientist trusts their notation system. It was a translation of the interior glyphs. Complete. She read it once. She read it again. She stood at the work surface for a long time without moving, the flimsy in one hand and the mask in the other. The controlled light source, casting the same, even illumination it always cast, and the silence of the room being exactly the silence it always was. Then she folded the flimsy, carefully. Along the same fold lines it had arrived, with not new folds, not her own arrangement, but the exact configuration it had been in when she found it. She placed it back inside the mask, in the position it had occupied, oriented the same way. She did not write down what it said. She did not copy it. She did not record it in any document or communicate it to any contact, or do any of the things that her decades of archival instinct would normally require of her when she encountered significant information that existed in only one place. She wrapped the mask in archival cloth, Jedi archival fabric preservation weave, the kind she had been using for 30 years, woven with a treatment that protected objects from humidity and temperature variation, and the slow decay that came from exposure to the ordinary atmosphere of any enclosed space. She had brought it from her own supply. She had not known, when she packed it, that she would need it for this specific object. She had brought it because she always brought it. Because she had learned, in a career spent preserving things, that the moment you stopped carrying the materials was the moment you found the object that needed them. She labeled the cloth in her own handwriting. Small, neat, the same script she had used in the Jedi archives for 40 years. Unknown origin, pre-rule of two. Handle with care. Not XoXaan's name. Not the translation, not what she knew, just what she could prove and what she needed the next person to understand. The cache was in a sub-level of a building, 3 districts from the safe room, a space she had prepared years before. Order 66, during a period when she had begun to understand, with the specific clarity that comes to careful people who are paying attention, that the Republic was not as stable as its institutions suggested. She had prepared several caches. This one she used rarely. It was not connected to any of her primary networks. No one she currently worked with knew it existed. She had chosen it for exactly this kind of object, the kind that needed to be preserved without being found, that needed a location no one would think to look because no one knew to look anywhere. She placed the wrapped mask on the shelf inside. She looked at it for a moment, the archival cloth, the neat label, the shape of the object beneath the fabric. Then she sealed the cache door. The street outside was crowded. Coruscant was always crowded. That had not changed under the Empire, would not change under whatever came after the Empire, was simply a fact of a world that had been continuously inhabited at maximum density for longer than most civilizations had existed. The people on the street were going about the business of living in an empire, keeping their heads down, moving with purpose, doing the specific performance of not noticing that had become the essential survival skill of the current era. Jocasta Nu turned a corner into the crowd. She did not look back. Looking back was not something she allowed herself. Not at the cache, not at the Jedi Temple, on the days when her route took her near enough to see what the Empire had made of it. Not at the archives, which still stood, but were no longer the archives, which had been repurposed and reorganized and stripped of the things that made them what they had been. She looked forward. She moved with the crowd. Behind her, the cache was sealed. The mask was inside it, wrapped in preservation cloth, labeled in her handwriting, carrying the copper tag and the crack and the interior inscription and the folded flimsy with the translation that she had read twice and returned without copying. It would stay there. She did not know, as she turned the corner and the crowd closed behind her, that she would not come back for it. She intended to come back. She had a list of things she intended to come back for, a list that had been growing longer since Order 66 and shorter only when something on it was lost permanently rather than recovered. The mask stayed on the list. She did not survive long enough to reach it. The cache stayed sealed. The street changed around it over the following decades. Buildings demolished and rebuilt. Businesses opened and closed. The physical fabric of the city renewing itself in the way cities do, continuously and without reference to what had been there before. The cache did not change. It held what it had been given. It waited for someone who knew it was there. No one who knew it was there was alive to open it. Coruscant had survived. That was the fact that still surprised people 2 years into the reconstruction. Not that it had been damaged. Everyone had expected damage, had prepared for damage, had built contingency plans around the assumption that the Yuuzhan Vong would do to the capital what they had done to a dozen other worlds. What surprised people was that it was still there at all, that the city planet had absorbed the occupation and the fighting and the specific category of destruction that the Yuuzhan Vong practiced, biological, organic, designed to unmake rather than simply demolish, and had come out the other side still recognizably itself, damaged, changed, in some districts unrecognizable, but there. The reconstruction had been underway for 2 years when Sale arrived. She had come from a preservation program based on Corellia, one of several that had sprung up in the immediate aftermath of the war, staffed by people whose professional training in conservation and historical recovery had suddenly become some of the most needed skills in the galaxy. The New Republic was trying to rebuild its physical infrastructure and its institutional memory simultaneously. And the second task was in many ways harder than the first. Buildings could be reconstructed from plans. What had been in the buildings, the records, the artifacts, the accumulated physical evidence of a civilization's history could not be reconstructed from anything once it was gone. Sale understood this. It was why she had applied for the Coruscant posting specifically over the objections of colleagues who thought the work there would be too large, too chaotic, too overwhelming for a team of any realistic size to make meaningful progress on. She had told them, meaningful progress and complete progress are not the same thing. You do what you can reach. Her team worked the sub-levels. The upper city had other teams larger, better resourced, focused on the infrastructure that the New Republic needed, operational before anything else. The sub-levels were Sael's domain because the sub-levels were where the things that didn't fit the upper city's priorities had ended up the caches and sealed rooms and forgotten spaces that the city had, accumulated across centuries of continuous habitation, compressed downward by the weight of everything built above them. Her method was systematic. She moved through a designated grid section, opening every sealed space she encountered and making an initial assessment before deciding how much time to spend. Most spaces took less than 10 minutes. She could determine within the first 30 seconds whether what she was looking at required specialist attention or could be logged and left for a lower priority follow-up team. She had opened hundreds of sealed spaces in 2 years. Most contained exactly what you would expect to find in the sub-levels of a city that had been continuously inhabited for longer than most civilizations had existed. Household goods from families who had moved to upper levels and never come back for what they'd stored below. Administrative records from organizations that had been dissolved in one of the Republic's many institutional reorganizations over the previous few centuries. Furniture, personal effects, the physical residue of lives that had moved on or ended. She logged everything. She moved on. The cache that Jocasta knew had sealed was in a sub-level that Sael's grid placed in the 43rd week of her Coruscant assignment. She almost didn't open it. The external condition of the cache door suggested age. The sealing mechanism was a type that had been in common use before the Clone Wars, which placed the cache's last access somewhere in the Imperial period or earlier. The Yuuzhan Vong occupation had left the surrounding corridor structurally intact but biologically marked. The organic residue that the Vong left on every surface they occupied had been cleared from the main corridors but not from the sub-level branches, and the walls here had the particular texture of a space that had been touched by something that wasn't supposed to be in it and had not been fully cleaned since. The cache door itself was untouched. The Vong had not opened it. Whatever mechanism had sealed, it was still intact. She could tell from the condition of the seam, which showed no evidence of forced entry or environmental compromise. She opened it with the standard bypass tool her team carried for exactly this kind of lock. The door swung inward. She put her lamp inside. The archival cloth was the first thing she saw. It was sitting on a shelf at approximately eye level, the only object in the cache, the only object that had ever been in the cache, positioned with a deliberateness that was immediately distinct from the casual disorder of most stored objects. Someone had placed this here carefully. Someone had come to this specific location with this specific object and put it down with intention. She did not touch it immediately. She photographed the cache interior, first standard documentation, full coverage, the same procedure she applied to every sealed space, regardless of what was inside. Then she moved closer and examined the cloth without touching it. Jedi preservation weave. She recognized it from her training not because she had handled much of it personally, but because it was the kind of material that conservation programs made a point of teaching their people to identify on sight. Rare, expensive, produced in limited quantities by a tradition that no longer existed in the form that had made it the specific weaving technique, was Jedi, which meant it had not been produced since Order 66, which meant anything wrapped in it had been wrapped before the Empire or in the early Imperial period by someone who had access to pre-Order 66 Jedi archival supplies. She photographed the cloth from 3 angles. She noted the label, the small, neat handwriting on the exterior of the wrapping, the words she could read clearly: unknown origin, pre-rule of 2, handle with care. She did not open the cloth. She logged the location, cross-referenced it with her grid documentation, photographed the cache door and the surrounding corridor, and contacted the Jedi Order's Historical Recovery Office with a description of what she had found. Then she sealed the cache again, not with the original mechanism, which she had bypassed and could not restore, but with a temporary seal from her kit that would hold the door closed and flag it as a located and pending item in her grid documentation. Then she moved on to the next sealed space in her grid. She had 12 more to open that day. The response from the Jedi Recovery Office took 3 weeks. Sael had not expected it to be faster. The Recovery Office was new, established in the immediate aftermath of the war, staffed by a small team operating out of what would eventually become the rebuilt Jedi Archives, but was currently a repurposed administrative building on the upper levels. They were doing the same work Sael was doing, on a larger scale and with more institutional weight behind it. 3 weeks was fast for what they were managing. The Jedi scholar who came was a human woman named Arden, middle-aged, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades in close contact with significant objects and have developed, through that contact, a kind of patience that ordinary urgency cannot disturb. She arrived with 2 assistants and a secure transport case. Sael met her at the cache and opened the temporary seal and stood back while Arden examined the space. Arden looked at the wrapped object for a long time without touching it. Then she looked at the label. Then she picked it up carefully, with both hands, with the specific handling technique that preservation training teaches and that Sael recognized and approved of, and carried it to the transport case. She did not unwrap it in the sub-level. She thanked Sael. She left. The unwrapping happened in the repurposed administrative building that was serving as the interim Jedi Archives. Arden did it alone, in the room she used for object examination, a space she had configured herself when the Recovery Office was established. With the controlled light sources and the documentation equipment and the handling materials that the work required. She set the wrapped object on the examination surface. She read the label again. Unknown origin. Pre-rule of 2. Handle with care. The handwriting was familiar to her. Not personally familiar, she had not known. Jocasta knew, had been a child when Order 66 happened, had grown up in a galaxy where the Jedi Archives were an imperial institution, and the woman who had run them for decades was a name in historical documents rather than a living person. But she knew the handwriting from those documents, from the cataloging notes and the acquisition records and the archival correspondence that had survived the Empire's reorganization of the archives in various fragmentary forms. She had handled enough of Jocasta Nu's written work in the course of her recovery efforts to recognize the script, the particular combination of precision and economy that belonged to someone who had written notes on significant objects for 40 years. She stood very still for a moment. Then she began the unwrapping. The preservation weave came away cleanly. It had done its work, held the sealed environment inside itself for the decades since Jocasta had placed it, kept the object within at the temperature and humidity that obsidian and whatever else was inside needed to remain stable. The mask was exactly as Jocasta had left it. Arden examined the exterior first. The obsidian surface, the depth of the black, the crack along the left cheekbone. She noted this carefully, photographed it from multiple angles, assessed it as old impact damage, fully stabilized, not a current structural concern. The exterior glyphs. She could read some of them. Her pre-classical Sith was functional rather than expert, enough to identify the period and approximate the content without achieving a full translation. What she could read confirmed the label's dating. Pre-rule of 2. Consistent with the founding period. The earliest generation of Sith scribal tradition on Korriban. She noted the copper-colored tag on the lower edge. She recognized the format immediately. Republic Archival Protocol, pre-XoXaan Reformation. She had encountered this format before in her recovery work, in objects that had passed through Republic custody before 1,000 years ago. The tag's number corresponded to no surviving record system she had access to, but the format itself was unambiguous. This object had been in Republic custody at some point before 1000 BBY. She photographed the tag. She turned the mask over. The interior glyphs were denser than the exterior. Same family, same approximate period, different hand. She spent 20 minutes attempting a translation and achieved perhaps a quarter of it. What she translated was consistent with a theoretical framework for dark side healing, compressed, precise, written by someone who understood the subject completely, rather than someone recording another's teaching. She noted the folded flimsy. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting on the flimsy was not Jocasta News. Different person, different style, more controlled, more architectural. The handwriting of someone who wrote with the precision of a person who trusted language to carry exact meaning and had no patience for approximation. It was a translation of the interior glyphs in High Galactic. Complete. She read it slowly, from the beginning. She read it again. She sat with the flimsy in her hands for a long time, not moving, not making notes, not doing any of the things that her training and her instincts and her professional obligations would normally have her doing at this stage of an examination. Just reading it a third time, in her head, without the flimsy in front of her, to make sure she had understood it correctly. She had understood it correctly. She folded the flimsy along its existing fold lines carefully, along the same creases, returning it to the configuration it had been in when Jocasta Nu had found it, when Plagueis had placed it, when XoXaan had created the object that had made the translation necessary. She placed it back inside the mask. She did not copy it. She did not record its contents in her examination notes. She wrote, in the notes only, interior flimsy present, appears to be translation of interior inscription. Author unknown. Contents noted. Noted. Not recorded. Not shared. She sat at the examination surface for a moment longer. Then she stood up and went to find the secure transfer cases. The decision to return the mask to Korriban was not complicated once she had made it. It took some institutional navigation. The recovery office had protocols for significant finds, and a founding period Sith artifact qualified as significant in ways that triggered multiple review requirements. She moved through the review process with the patient efficiency of someone who understood bureaucratic systems well enough to work within them at speed. She provided the documentation the review required. She answered the questions that were asked of her. She did not share the contents of the flimsy with anyone who asked about the interior examination. What she wrote in her recovery log was this: object consistent with XoXaan attribution, founding period, Korriban, provenance. Interior inscription in unknown subsystem, translation not achieved. Recommend return to site of origin per recovery protocol. 7. Objects of clear provenance and significant dark side resonance. This object belongs where it was made. The last sentence was not strictly protocol language. It was instinct, written down because she trusted her instincts enough to make them part of the record. The review approved the return. She arranged the transport herself. A small vessel, a two-person crew she had worked with before on sensitive recovery transfers, a flight plan that took them to Korriban without unnecessary stops. She traveled with the mask. She did not send it ahead, did not hand it off to a transport service, did not let it out of her direct custody for the duration of the journey. She sat with it in the secure case in the cargo hold for most of the transit. She did not open the case. She did not need to open it to be aware of what it carried. The resonance of the object was present even through the case's shielding, the same way that very large things are present even when you are not looking at them, not threatening, not aggressive. Simply there, with the weight of something that had been there for a very long time and intended to continue being there. She thought about Jocasta Nu during the transit. About the woman who had sealed this cache on a crowded Coruscant street and walked away without looking back. About what Jocasta had known when she sealed it, what she had read in the flimsy, what she had understood about the mask's history from the copper tag and the exterior glyphs, and the interior inscription she could only partially read. About the choice to preserve rather than study, to protect rather than analyze, to put the thing somewhere safe and trust that the galaxy would eventually produce someone who could handle it properly. Arden did not know if she was that person. She knew she was the person who was here now. That was enough. Korriban. The transport set down in the valley approach. There was no landing facility in the Valley of the Dark Lords itself, had never been one. The world's status as a restricted site under New Republic protocol, meaning that any vessel that came here came with authorization and came prepared to walk the last distance on foot. The red dust came up immediately when the landing ramp descended. Arden had been to Korriban once before, years earlier, on a recovery expedition that had focused on the main tombs. She remembered the quality of the world, not the landscape specifically, not the color of the stone or the direction of the wind, but the weight of it, the accumulated presence, 7,000 years of dark side history compressing itself into the air and the ground and the silence of the valley. It was the same. Whatever the Yuuzhan Vong had done to the galaxy, they had not touched Korriban. Or rather, Korriban had not allowed itself to be touched. The world had a way of discouraging visitors who came without the right orientation toward it. The Vong, who rejected the Force entirely, would have found Korriban particularly hostile. She carried the case herself. Her crew stayed with the transport. The walk to the Valley of the Dark Lords took 40 minutes across terrain that was easier to navigate than it looked from the air. The path was old, worn into the stone by thousands of years of people making this same approach, and the stone knew the way even when the path wasn't visible. She found XoXaan's tomb. By the description in the recovery records, the valley's layout had been documented enough times across enough centuries that a careful reader could navigate it from the literature alone. The main tomb entrance was marked with the same worn stone that every expedition report had described the outer door, the evidence of multiple sealing and unsealing operations across the centuries, the interior that researchers had documented and left largely intact. She found the secondary chamber to the left of the main entrance. Small, low ceiling, single entrance. The floor was flat stone with a slight circular depression near the far wall, consistent with what early expedition reports had described as an impression left by an object resting there for a very long time. She set the case down in the center of the chamber. She opened it. She lifted the mask, still wrapped in Jocasta Nu's archival cloth, still labeled in Jocasta's handwriting, and carried it to the area near the depression. She set it down on the stone floor, not in the depression, near it, close enough that whoever came next would find both the impression of where the stand had been and the mask that had rested on that stand, reunited after 7,000 years of separation. She stood in the chamber for a moment. The silence of Korriban was around her, the same silence the acolyte had felt, the same silence the mask had rested in for 1,000 years before Plagueis' agent came, the same silence that had held the valley since before XoXaan arrived, and would hold it long after everyone currently alive had stopped mattering to it. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She picked up the empty case. She walked back through the entrance. She sealed the chamber door behind her, not with a permanent seal, not with anything that would prevent future access, but with the temporary conservation seal that marked the space as a located and protected site in the New Republic's Heritage Registry. The seal went on cleanly. She walked back through the valley. The red dust settled around her footprints. The transport was where she had left it. Her crew asked how it had gone. She said, "Fine." She stowed the empty case. The transport lifted. Below, the valley returned to the quality it always returned to when people left it. The silence, the weight, the accumulated presence of everything it had held since the beginning. The secondary chamber held the mask. The mask held everything else. The transport climbed through Korriban's amber sky, and the valley shrank below it, and the red stone blurred into the larger red of the planet's surface. And then the planet itself became a point of light among other points of light. And then the jump to hyperspace took everything away at once. The valley was alone. The chamber was sealed. The mask was on the floor where Arden had set it, wrapped in Jocasta Nu's archival cloth, labeled in Jocasta's handwriting, carrying the copper tag and the crack and the interior inscription and the folded flimsy with the translation that 3 people had now read and none of them had shared. Korriban breathed around it, as it always had, as it would continue to do for as long as the world existed, and the valley held its silence, and the stone remembered what it had been given. The mask was home. It did not know it was home. It simply was, as it had always simply been, present, still, carrying what it carried, waiting for nothing in particular and everything at once. The chamber is still. It has been still for 10 years. Not the stillness of a space that is waiting to be used, not the stillness of a room between occupants, the temporary quiet of a place that expects someone to return. The stillness of the secondary chamber adjacent to XoXaan's tomb is older than that. It is the stillness of a place that has learned, across centuries of intermittent visitation, that the quiet between people is always longer than the time people spend inside it. The conservation seal on the door is intact. It has held through 10 Korriban winters, the season when the wind from the southern plateaus comes down cold and carries a different quality of grit than the summer wind, finer, more penetrating, the kind that finds every gap and fills it, The seal has held against this. It has held against the occasional tremor that moves through the valley's stone when the tectonic activity that underlies the entire region shifts and settles. It has held against the decade of slow atmospheric pressure change that every sealed space experiences as the world outside it goes through its cycles. No one has opened it from the outside. No one has tried. The valley is quiet this morning. Korriban in 40 ABY is a world the New Republic monitors but does not administer, too saturated with dark side energy for permanent habitation, too historically significant to ignore entirely, too inhospitable for any civilian population that did not specifically choose to live on a world that wanted them gone. The monitoring is remote. Automated sensors in the upper atmosphere track vessel approaches and flag unauthorized landings. A quarterly report is filed with the New Republic's Heritage Registry Office, noting any detected changes to the valley's documented sites. The report goes to a desk where it is reviewed by a specialist who has never visited Korriban personally and relies entirely on the sensor data and the existing documentation to assess whether anything requires physical follow-up. The last physical follow-up was 6 years ago. A research team from the University of Coruscant, studying the geological history of the valley's formation, interested in the stone, not the force, not the history, not the tombs. They had the right clearances. They filed the right documentation. They spent 4 days on the surface, collected their samples from the valley walls, and left without entering any of the burial sites. They did not enter the secondary chamber. Their report mentioned it only as a documented heritage site with an active conservation seal, noted, recorded, not disturbed. The quarterly monitoring report, filed 3 months after their departure, noted no changes. The one after that noted no changes. Every one since has noted no changes. Inside the chamber, the archival cloth has faded slightly. Not much. Jedi preservation weave was designed to resist exactly this kind of slow environmental degradation. The fabric treatment that protected objects from humidity and temperature variation also slowed the cloth's own aging. But 10 years of Korriban's particular atmosphere, even in a sealed space, has touched it. The color has shifted from the original cream white of new preservation cloth to something warmer, slightly amber, the way old paper yellows not from damage but from time. The label is still legible. Jocasta News handwriting, small, neat. The script of someone who had written archival notes for 40 years is still clear on the cloth's exterior. Unknown origin, pre-rule of 2. Handle with care. 3 facts and 1 instruction. Everything she knew that she could prove. Everything she needed the next person to understand before they touched what was inside. The cloth is wrapped exactly as she wrapped it, the same folds, the same configuration, the same careful arrangement that she had spent perhaps 2 minutes on in a safe room on Coruscant approximately 50 years ago, before she sealed the cache and walked away and did not look back. The mask has not moved since Arden set it down. It is on the floor of the secondary chamber, in the area near the slight circular depression in the stone, the depression left by the carved obsidian stand that XoXaan had placed beside her sleeping area 7,000 years ago. The impression of an object that rested in the same position long enough to compress the stone beneath it. The stand is gone. The impression remains. The mask rests near it, not in it, near it, placed by Arden with the instinct of someone who understood that proximity and identity are not the same thing. The mask belongs to this chamber. The depression belongs to a time before the mask was ever removed. They are related. They are not the same. The cloth can be unwrapped now, in the present tense of this moment, and what is inside described precisely. The obsidian surface is unchanged. 7,000 years of existence of handling and storage and transit and ceremony and war and empire and archive and theft and ritual and recovery have not altered the fundamental quality of the stone. The depth of the black is the same depth that the carver of the Third Valley produced when he sourced the material from the Deep Valley deposit that XoXaan had specified. Not flat black. A black with interior distance to it, a quality that shifts as the light source moves, as though the darkness inside the stone is not uniform all the way through. It is the same stone it has always been. The exterior glyphs are unchanged. XoXaan's notation system, the early pre-classical Sith script that she and the other exiles developed in the first years on Korriban, before the scribal tradition had time to standardize, is carved into the obsidian surface with the precision that the carver of the Third Valley brought to the commission. Each glyph is clean. Each line is deliberate. The instruction on the exterior is exactly what it was on the morning the mask was finished. The theoretical framework for the dark side healing methodology, compressed into a notation system that almost no one living can read. Almost no one. There are perhaps 2 individuals alive who could read these glyphs with the fluency required to translate them. One of them does not know the mask exists. The other knows it exists and knows where it is and has chosen, for reasons recorded only in a private log, that is itself stored in an archive that no one has thought to cross-reference with the mask's location, not to return to it yet. The exterior glyphs hold what they have always held. They are patient. The crack is still there. It will always be there now. The hairline fracture along the left cheekbone running from just below the eye opening to the edge of the jaw, clean and precise. The product of a single impact in a burning basement on a World 3 systems from Korriban, approximately 6,700 years ago, has been part of the mask for longer than most of the civilizations that have existed since. Then, it formed when Merrick's citadel collapsed, when the carved box that held the mask split open, and the mask hit the basement wall and the stone took the impact. The way stone takes impacts by distributing the force along the path of least resistance, which in this case ran from the cheekbone toward the jaw. 6,700 years. The crack has been in the mask for 6,700 years. Everyone who has handled the mask since that moment has encountered it first, before the glyphs, before the weight, before any other quality of the object. It announces itself. It catches light before anything else does. It is the first thing the eye finds. It is the oldest wound the mask carries. And it is here, in the present tense of this morning, in the secondary chamber on Korriban, doing what it has always done, holding what comes to it, waiting for the light. The copper-colored tag is on the lower edge, still wired there, still stamped with the number that the archivist on Coruscant assigned to it approximately 5,000 years ago, in the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War, when the scholar of the Third Expedition's collection was processed by a Republic Recovery Division that was moving too fast and had too much to handle to give any single object the attention it deserved. The number corresponds to no surviving record system. The archival format it belongs to has not been in use for nearly 5,000 years. 3 complete reorganizations of the Republic's archival infrastructure have occurred since the tag was applied, each one migrating records from the previous system into the new one, and somewhere in the third migration, or possibly the second, the specific record that matched this tag's number was lost. Not deliberately, not through negligence, exactly. through the accumulation of small administrative decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time and collectively produced a gap. The tag remains. The record is gone. The tag is all that documents the mask's time in Republic custody. 4,000 years of storage in a sub-level corridor on Coruscant, mislabeled, translation pending, sitting in a crate that no one opened from the moment the lock clicked until the moment a thief bypassed it during the chaos of the new Sith Wars. 4,000 years. The tag is smaller than a thumbnail. It holds all of that. The folded flimsy is inside the mask, tucked against the interior surface, in the curve near the cheekbone, where Darth Plagueis placed it. On the morning after the third day of his examination, the morning after he had read the interior inscription and sat looking at the ceiling for a very long time, and then produced a translation in high, galactic on a thin strip of writing material and folded it and placed it here. The flimsy is approximately 70 years old. In a mask that is 7,000 years old, 70 years is recent. The flimsy is practically new by the mask's standards, placed there within living memory by someone whose name is known to history, whose significance to the galaxy's story is enormous, even if his connection to this specific object is known to almost no one. The translation is still on it, still legible. The high galactic handwriting, controlled, architectural, precise, has not faded. The flimsy's material has yellowed slightly, the same slow aging process as Jocasta Nu's archival cloth. But the ink is stable and the words are clear. 3 people have read it. Plagueis, who wrote it. Jocasta Nu, who found it in a safe room on Coruscant and read it twice and returned it without copying it. Arden, who found it in a repurposed administrative building that was becoming the rebuilt Jedi archives and read it 3 times and returned it without sharing it. 3 people, none of them alive now. The translation of what XoXaan wrote, the complete theoretical framework for the dark side healing methodology that she developed on Korriban 7,000 years ago. The thing that every second-generation copy of a copy had lost in the process of transmission, the why that had been missing from the Sith healing tradition since the Rule of Two had simplified it out of existence, is folded inside the mask in a room that no one is visiting. It has been there for 70 years. It will continue to be there until someone opens the chamber and opens the cloth and finds the mask and turns it over and looks inside. The interior glyphs are what they have always been. XoXaan's inscription, cut with her own medical instrument on the day the carver of the Third Valley finished the exterior, a day in what the Sith counted as the 3rd year of the exile settlement. A day that has no name in any calendar currently in use. A day so far in the past that the civilization that was being founded when it happened has risen and fallen and risen and fallen so many times since that the original founding feels less like a historical event and more like a geological one. The glyphs are small and dense. They are in a notation subsystem that XoXaan developed herself, modifications to the pre-classical Sith script that the exiles were already developing. Adjustments that she made because the existing system could not carry the concepts she needed to record. The private language of a precise mind working at the edge of what any existing system could describe. Almost no one living can read them. The translation is inside the mask. The mask carries both. The second layer is still there. Beneath XoXaan's resonance, beneath the accumulated force presence of every owner who has held the mask across 7,000 years of history, beneath Merrick's brief wearing and the scholar's careful handling and the archivist's copper tag and the 4,000 years of storage and the thief's unknown journey, and the acolytes 3 weeks, and the ritual at the unnamed crater, and Plagueis's 3 days of examination, and Jocasta Nu's day of study, and Arden's careful return. Beneath all of it, the second layer sits in the mask's stone, the way deep water sits in stone, not visible on the surface, not detectable without the right kind of attention, but present with the complete and total presence of something that has been there long enough to become part of the structure rather than a feature of it. A Force-sensitive individual who held the mask right now would feel it. They would feel XoXaan's layer first, the strongest, the oldest established, the one that has had the longest time to saturate the obsidian, the dark side healing methodology. The precise, theoretical, completely unsentimental approach to the Force as a tool that could be used in 2 directions simultaneously. The specific quality of a mind that had been a healer and had decided to become something else without abandoning the healer's fundamental orientation toward the body and what it could survive. They would feel Marek beneath that fainter, more diffuse, the residue of a single night's wearing and a century and a half of proximity, the careful scholarly attention, the specific quality of a mind that understood the significance of what it held without understanding its content. They would feel the scholar's handling briefer still, the faintest trace of someone who had recognized the object's importance without the framework to assess it, who had wired a copper tag to its lower edge and written 3 sentences in an archival record and moved on to the next object in a collection that needed processing. They would feel the acolyte, not a name, not a history, just a quality, young, alone, the particular resonance of someone who had held the mask close to their face for a moment of examination and felt observed and set it down carefully and never picked it up again. The resonance of someone who had decided the mask belonged somewhere more than she did. They would feel Plagueis cold, precise, the specific temperature of an enormous intellect directing its full attention at a single object, the quality of recognition, the quality of someone who had found a piece of something they had been looking for 20 years and was now sitting very still while they understood what it meant. They would feel Jocasta Nu, and this layer would feel different from the others, would carry a quality that none of the previous ones had. Not scholarly, not acquisitive, custodial. The specific weight of someone who had taken responsibility for a thing knowing they might not be able to protect it forever. The quality of a person who wrapped something carefully and labeled it and sealed it in the best available hiding place, and walked away without looking back, because looking back was not a luxury she could afford. Grieving, determined, careful, the quality of someone doing their best with what they had. And then, beneath all of these, beneath every layer that any documented owner had left in the stone, the second layer, the thing from the unnamed world, the thing from the crater that was not made by any weapon, on the continent with no name, on the world that no current map identifies, the thing that the ritual at the Nexus placed in the mask's obsidian without leaving any record of what it was or what it was for or who had carried the mask there and why. It is not dark side energy. It is not light side energy. It is not the Force, as any tradition has codified it, not Jedi, not Sith, not any of the intermediate traditions that the galaxy's long history has produced, and the 2 major ones have absorbed or destroyed. It is older than those categories. It is the Force as it existed before anyone thought to divide it, before the philosophy, before the war between the philosophies, before the 10,000 years of conflict that the division produced. It simply is, with the specific weight of something that has existed long enough that its existence has stopped being an event and become a condition. A Force-sensitive individual holding the mask would feel this layer last. and would feel it most deeply, and would have no framework for what they were feeling, and would set the mask down carefully afterward and sit across from it for a long time without speaking. The same way the acolyte did. The same way Merrick did, though he described it differently. The same way Jocasta Nu did, in a safe room on Coruscant, with the flimsy in her hands, and the controlled light source casting its even illumination, and the silence of the city pressing in from every direction. The chamber is still. The mask is on the floor. The archival cloth is wrapped around it, slightly faded, label intact. The copper tag is on the lower edge. The crack is along the left cheekbone. The interior glyphs are in the stone. The flimsy is folded inside. The second layer is beneath everything. Outside the secondary chamber, the Valley of the Dark Lords holds its silence, the same silence it has held since before XoXaan arrived, since before the 8 exiles landed on this red world and began the long, complicated process of becoming the thing that would reshape the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. The tombs are there. Ajunta Paul's tomb, entered and studied, and entered again across 70 centuries of Sith pilgrimage, Marka Ragnos, Tulak Horde, Naga Sado, the names that the Sith tradition preserved across its rises and falls, the names that became legend, and then monument, and then the specific kind of presence that a sealed stone chamber accumulates when it has been significant for long enough. XoXaan's main tomb is among them. The stand is still inside, the low table, the sealed containers of her medical instruments, the circular impression on the stand surface where the mask rested for 2 centuries before Merrick took it. The mask is not there. It is in the secondary chamber, 30 feet away, wrapped in a dead woman's archival cloth, labeled in a dead woman's handwriting, carrying a dead man's translation of a dead woman's inscription, tagged with a dead institution's catalog number, cracked by a war that ended 6,700 years ago, resonant with the touch of everyone who has held it across a history longer than any currently existing civilization. The light comes through a gap in the sealed door. It is morning on Korriban, the sun at the angle where it enters the valley from the east and moves along the cliff faces in a slow horizontal line, illuminating the stone in the particular amber that gives the world its color, the warm red gold of a star that has been rising over this valley for longer than any record accounts for. The gap in the conservation seal is small, not a failure of the seal, a deliberate feature, a ventilation provision that Arden had built into her application of it, because completely sealed spaces develop atmospheric issues over long periods, and she had intended the mask to be here for a long time. The light enters through the gap. It travels across the floor of the chamber, a thin line, precise, moving as the sun moves, crossing the stone slowly, in the way that light crosses stone when there is nothing to interrupt it. It reaches the mask. It reaches the crack along the left cheekbone. The crack holds it. For a moment, a specific, unrepeatable moment, in the morning of a day in 40 ABY, on a world that has been accumulating significance since before the Republic existed, in a chamber that no one is visiting, beside the impression of a stand that has held nothing for 7,000 years, the crack along the left cheekbone of an obsidian mask holds a thin line of red Korriban light, the oldest wound the mask carries, holding the light the way wounds hold things completely, without intention, without awareness, simply because the gap in the stone is shaped to receive exactly this. Then the sun moves. The light moves with it. The crack releases what it held. The chamber returns to the quality of darkness that is Korriban's natural condition, not complete dark, Not the dark of the Coruscant archive, where the lamp was turned off and no one was coming. The dark of a world that holds its light differently, that absorbs it into the stone rather than reflecting it back, that has been keeping what it is given since before anyone was here to give it anything. The mask is still. It has always been still, when no one was holding it. It has always been this present, precise, carrying what it carries in the specific silence of a place that knows how to wait. XoXaan set it down 7,000 years ago and saw her own reflection in the polished surface for a moment before turning away. It is set down now. The reflection it holds is the chamber, the low ceiling, the stone floor, the thin line of light that has already moved on. Everything it has survived is in it. All of it still there, all of it held, all of it waiting without knowing it is waiting, in the dark and the silence of a world that has always known how to keep what it is given and has never learned how to let it go.